The morning Gideon Ashcroft slammed a wad of cash on the kitchen table and told Rosalie Mercer she had 24 hours to pack her things and disappear. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood there with flour still dusted on her hands and looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she once believed was worth saving. And she made a decision that would change every single life under that roof. But we need to go back. Because stories like this one don't begin with the ending. They begin with $42, a suitcase held shut with a belt, and a woman standing at the edge of a dirt road in West Texas, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. If it were you standing there, broke, alone, and staring at a stranger's front porch, would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed? Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel right now, because this story will reach into your chest and grab something you forgot was there. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The bus from Amarillo dropped Rosalie Mercer at the junction of Route 9 and a county road with no name on a Tuesday in early March. And the driver didn't even wait for her to fully clear the steps before he pulled away. She stood there in the cold with her suitcase, one of those old hard-shell ones, powder blue, the kind her mother had bought at a church sale 15 years ago. And she watched the taillights disappear around a bend in the flat Texas road. She had $42 in an envelope inside her coat pocket. She had a folded piece of newspaper with an advertisement circled in red ink, and she had nothing else. No plan B, no family to call, no apartment to go back to in Wichita because the apartment was gone, the job at the diner was gone, and the man she'd spent 3 years believing in had taken the rest when he left. She was 31 years old and starting over from a dead stop. The advertisement had been small, the kind that gets buried under the car listings and the furniture sales. Help wanted. Ranch housekeeping, Harlan County. Room and board included. Meals provided. References preferred but not required. Inquire at Ashcroft Ranch, County Road 7, Haskell. There was a phone number that rang 11 times before anyone answered, and when someone finally did, it was a man's voice, rough and short, like a man who'd been interrupted. And he'd said yes, the position was still open, and yes, she could come. And no, he didn't need to talk about it at length. Then he'd hung up. She'd written down the address and bought a bus ticket the same afternoon. Now she stood at the junction with a map she'd printed at the library back in Wichita, and according to that map, she had about 1.5 miles to walk on a road that was more dirt than gravel. The sky was the color of old pewter. The wind had the kind of edge that doesn't announce itself. It just finds every gap in your coat and settles in. She picked up the suitcase and started walking. She gave herself the whole walk to have second thoughts. She thought about the voice on the phone and the way it had shut down the moment the basic facts were exchanged. She thought about the advertisement saying references preferred but not required, which most people would take as a kindness but which she had learned to read as desperation. She thought about the fact that she hadn't told anyone where she was going because there was no one left to tell. By the time the ranch came into view, she had talked herself out of it and back into it 3 separate times. The house was 2 stories, white paint gone gray, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. There were trucks in the yard, 2 of them, one up on blocks, and a barn that looked solid but tired, the way old barns do when the repairs have been keeping pace with the damage but only barely. There was a fence along the near pasture that had been mended in so many places it looked like a patchwork quilt laid flat on the ground. She opened the gate latch and walked up the dirt path to the porch steps. That's when she saw them. 4 children sitting in a row on the porch steps like they'd been placed there. The oldest was a boy, maybe 13 or 14, with dark circles under his eyes and the posture of someone who had been carrying weight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Next to him was a girl around 11, arms crossed, chin out, watching Rosalie come up the walk with the particular suspicion of a child who has been disappointed enough times to make suspicion a habit. Then a smaller boy, 8 or 9, with a dirt smudge across one cheek, who was watching her feet instead of her face. And at the end, barely 4 years old, a little boy in rubber boots 2 sizes too big, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. None of them said anything. Rosalie stopped at the bottom step. She looked at the 4 of them. She thought, what in God's name have I walked into? I'm Rosalie Mercer, she said. I spoke with, I assume your father on the phone, about the housekeeping position? The oldest boy nodded once. He's in the barn. Do you want to go get him, or should I? He said to wait. So she waited. She set her suitcase down on the porch. The little one at the end, the one in the rubber boots, kept looking at her sideways. Not afraid exactly. More like he was trying to figure out whether she was the kind of person who left quickly or the kind who stayed. She understood the question even though he hadn't asked it out loud. Gideon Ashcroft came out of the barn about 8 minutes later. She knew it was 8 minutes because she counted. He was a tall man, broader across the shoulders than she'd expected, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point where you could easily guess his age. Late 30s, maybe 40. He walked like someone whose body hurt but who had decided not to mention it. He was wiping his hands on a cloth that had already been wiped on too many times to do much good. He stopped about 10 feet from the porch steps and looked at her. "Ms. Mercer." "Yes." He looked at her suitcase, then at her coat, then briefly at her face, the way a man looks at someone when he's assessing situation rather than making conversation. "You smaller than I expected," he said. It was not a greeting and it was not a compliment. It was an observation the way a rancher observes weather, practical, without particular feeling attached. "I do the work of someone larger," she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile. More like a door opened a quarter inch and then stayed. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you what you'd be dealing with." What she was dealing with was a kitchen that had been functional and nothing more for what looked like at least a year. There were dishes done but stacked without order. There was food in the pantry but organized the way a man organizes food, by fit rather than by category, things shoved in wherever they went. The floor was clean but the corners weren't. The table had 6 chairs around it, and one of them had a leg mended with wire and electrical tape. The living room was worse in a different way. It was tidy. Someone had been trying, but it had the specific blankness of a room where nothing decorative had been touched since a loss. No flowers. No throw pillows. A photograph on the wall, framed, that showed a woman with dark hair laughing at something off camera, and below it a small empty space on the wallpaper where something else had hung and been taken down. Rosalie saw all of this in about 45 seconds and understood what the advertisement hadn't said. "Your wife," she said carefully, not looking at the photograph directly. 14 months ago, Gideon said. He said it like a man reciting a fact, not like a man sharing a grief, which told her the grief was still very much present and very much unmanaged. "I'm sorry." He nodded. A short nod, the kind that closes a subject. He showed her the room she'd be staying in, small, off the back of the kitchen, with a single window that looked out over the vegetable garden that had gone to weeds. There was a bed with a clean quilt on it, a dresser with a crooked knob on the second drawer, and a hook on the back of the door. It smelled like cedar and old paint. "Meals, room, and board," he said. $250 a week. Sundays are yours afternoon. The children are your responsibility from 6 in the morning until I come in from the field, which is usually around 7. School runs Monday through Friday. Bus comes at 7:15. He said all of this the way you'd read items off an invoice. Any questions? She had approximately 40 questions. She asked the most important one. What exactly happened to your previous housekeeper? A pause. Not a guilty pause. A tired one. She lasted 3 weeks, he said. The one before her, 6 days. Rosalie stood there in the doorway of that small room with its cedar smell and its crooked drawer knob. $250 a week. A bed, meals, and a household that had already defeated 2 other women before her. She thought about $42 and a one-way bus ticket. I'll try it for 1 week, she said. We'll see how it suits. He looked at her for a moment. Fair enough, he said. Then he walked back down the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed, alone, and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She could leave in the morning. She could call the bus depot, ask about the next departure north. She could figure something else out. Then she heard it, from the kitchen. A small sound, half swallowed, the kind of sound a child makes when he's been trying not to cry for so long that one small thing is enough to break through. It was the little one, the one in the rubber boots. She sat still and listened to that small, muffled, trying so hard sound for about 10 seconds. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and started figuring out what she could make for dinner from what was in that pantry. Her name was Rosalie Ann Mercer, and she was not a remarkable woman in the ways that get written about. She wasn't beautiful in any spectacular sense. She had a broad, honest face and dark brown hair she pinned back without ceremony, and she was a little too thin because the past year had been the kind of year that does that to a person. She was not formally educated beyond high school and one semester of community college in Dodge City that she'd had to stop when her mother got sick. She was not particularly confident. She second-guessed herself often and thoroughly. What she was stubborn. Not the loud kind of stubborn, not the kind that argues and digs its heels in and announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that just keeps going after everyone else has decided the situation is impossible. Her mother had called it mule-headedness and meant it as a criticism. Her fourth-grade teacher had called it perseverance and meant it as a compliment. Rosalie had always figured they were both looking at the same thing from different angles. She had grown up in a small house outside Pratt, Kansas, with her mother and her father and her younger brother Dale, and it had not been a bad childhood so much as a careful one. The kind of childhood where you learn early that things are finite and breakable, and you treat them accordingly. Her father worked at the grain elevator and her mother cleaned houses for families on the better side of town, and they had been decent people who loved their children without finding the words for it very often. Rosalie had learned to cook at 8 because her mother's back started giving out early, and by 12 she was the one getting dinner on the table most nights while her mother sat with a heating pad and her father watched the news. She hadn't resented it. It was just the way of things. Some families operate on effort more than sentiment, and you learn to read the effort as the love it's standing in for. She'd come to Texas chasing none of those memories. She'd come because the life she'd been building in Kansas had fallen apart in the particular quiet way that lives fall apart, when you've made choices based on someone else's version of what was possible. His name was Mark, and he'd been charming, and he'd had plans, and she had believed in both the charm and the plans longer than she should have. When it ended, she was left with the lease, the bills, the realization that she had spent 3 years building something with someone who had been building an exit the whole time, and the specific humiliation of having to admit to yourself that you saw the signs and chose not to read them. She'd packed what mattered, sold what she could, and answered an advertisement in a newspaper because the other options were worse. The first morning at Ashcroft Ranch, she was up at 5:15. She found the kitchen in the dark and stood there for a moment, listening to the house. It was a sound she'd know anywhere, the specific silence of sleeping children, which is different from all other kinds of silence. Softer, more fragile. She opened the refrigerator. There were eggs, a lot of them, which made sense on a ranch. Butter, a block of cheese, half a pound of bacon that was still good. She found potatoes in a basket under the counter and onions hanging in a net near the back door. She found flour and salt and baking powder and a cast-iron skillet that weighed about 12 pounds and had clearly been the most used thing in this kitchen for 20 years. She made biscuits from scratch, the way her mother had taught her, working the butter into the flour with her fingers until it was the right consistency. She fried the bacon and set it to drain and scrambled the eggs with cheese and diced onion. She found coffee, a big tin of it, and got the percolator going. By 6:30, the kitchen smelled like a home instead of a house, and she was filling a pitcher of orange juice from a can. There wasn't a lot she could do about that yet, when she heard the floor creak in the hallway. The 11-year-old. The girl with her arms crossed and her chin out. Her name, Rosalie had gathered from the previous evening, was Cora. She stood in the kitchen doorway in pajamas with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and looked at the spread on the table. The biscuits in a cloth-lined basket, the eggs in a bowl, the bacon on a plate, with an expression that was trying very hard to be unimpressed. "You made biscuits," Cora said. "I did. Mom used to make biscuits." She said it not like a compliment, more like an accusation, like Rosalie had done something she had no right to. Rosalie turned back to the stove and poured herself a mug of coffee. "Sit down if you want to eat," she said. "Or don't. Up to you." A silence. Then the sound of a chair being pulled out. That was how it started with Cora. Not warmly, but honestly. The oldest boy's name was Eli, and he had been carrying the ranch on his 14-year-old shoulders for 14 months. Not because Gideon had asked him to. Gideon would have been horrified to know the extent of it, but because Eli was the kind of boy who filled in gaps as a reflex. He was the one who made sure the younger ones got to the bus. He was the one who made sure there was cereal in the cabinet. He was the one who noticed when the second to youngest, Owen, had a fever and needed to stay home, and who made the call about what to do about it. He watched Rosalie the way a boy watches someone who might be dangerous to trust. She didn't push it. She didn't try to win him over. She just made sure he saw Every day that she did what she said she was going to do and didn't do what she said she wasn't going to do. Small things, consistent things. She said she'd have breakfast ready by 6:30 and it was ready at 6:28 every morning. She said she'd handle the laundry and she did it without being asked twice. She said she'd leave his room alone and she left it alone, even when the mess behind that closed door was audible in the way only teenage boy messes can be. After 4 days, he stopped watching her with that particular wariness. He didn't relax exactly, but he stopped bracing. The middle one, Owen, the 8-year-old with the dirt smudge, turned out to be the easiest and the most heartbreaking simultaneously. He was easy because he wanted to be near her. He simply fell into orbit around her the way small children do when they sense warmth and have been without it too long. He followed her from room to room and asked her the kind of ceaseless, slightly random questions that 8-year-old boys ask. Questions about spiders and cloud formations and whether horses dream, and she answered every single one as seriously as she could, because she understood that the questions weren't really about spiders or clouds or horses. The heartbreaking part was that she could feel how much he'd needed this, and for how long, and it sat in her chest like a stone. The youngest, whose name was Samuel, but who everyone called Sam, didn't talk much. She'd learned that first night. He was 4 and he talked, but not often, and not to people he wasn't sure about yet. He communicated largely through proximity. If he trusted you, he would simply appear next to you. If he didn't, he stayed at the edges of rooms and watched. On the 3rd day, he appeared at her elbow while she was folding laundry and handed her his stuffed rabbit. She understood this was significant and handled it accordingly. She looked at the rabbit with genuine seriousness. "What's his name?" she asked. Sam considered. "Rabbit," he said. "That's a good name," she said. "Very clear." Sam nodded and took Rabbit back, satisfied, and sat on the floor next to the laundry basket and watched her fold things for the next 20 minutes without saying another word. She had told Gideon she'd try 1 week. By the end of day 3, she knew she wasn't leaving in a week. She didn't let herself think too far past that. Gideon Ashcroft was not an easy man. She understood this without needing to be told. He was not cruel. She'd been around cruel men and she knew the particular weight of that kind of room. And this wasn't it. But he was closed in a way that went beyond grieving. He was a man who had decided somewhere along the way that needing something from another person was a form of weakness he couldn't afford, and he had organized his life accordingly. He worked. He handled what needed handling. He didn't talk about anything that existed below the surface. She gave him the same treatment she gave Eli. She didn't push. She didn't try to make him comfortable through conversation. She left him alone when he wanted to be left alone, and was there when she was supposed to be there and didn't make her presence require anything from him. The first real conversation they had, past logistics, past the short exchanges about the schedule and the household, happened on the 5th evening. She was sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, going through a shopping list for the following week, trying to figure out how to feed 5 people decently on the budget he'd left her, which was not an impossible budget, but required thought. She heard his boots on the porch, the door open, the sound of him washing up at the mudroom sink. He came into the kitchen, saw her at the table, and stopped. "Didn't think you'd still be up," he said. "Working on the grocery list. We're going to need more flour before the end of next week. And the boys are both going through growth spurts, I think. They're eating more than the budget accounts for." He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. He didn't ask her to recalculate, didn't tell her to make do. He said, "Add what's needed. I'll figure it out." She added it to the list. A silence settled. Not a comfortable silence and not an uncomfortable one. Just a silence between 2 people who weren't sure yet what they were to each other. "The kids," he said finally. "They seem—" He stopped, started again. "Owen talked at dinner tonight. He talked about the spider he found in the barn. He talked. He said it quietly, like the fact of it meant something. He hasn't talked much at dinner for a while." She looked down at her list. "He's a boy who wants to tell people things," she said carefully. "He just needs to know someone's listening." Another silence. "Previous ones," Gideon said. "The 2 before you. The first one." He rubbed the back of his neck. She yelled. Not at the children, but near them. She had a temper and she wasn't quiet about it, and Sam stopped talking entirely for 2 weeks after she left. He paused. "Second one wasn't a bad woman. Just couldn't. She wasn't built for this kind of situation. She cried a lot, privately, but the kids heard her." Rosalie looked at him across the table. He He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, the way men look when they're saying something they haven't said out loud before. "I'm not going to yell," she said, "and I'm not going to cry where they can hear it." He looked at her then, directly. "Why'd you answer the advertisement?" he asked. It was a simple question with a complicated answer, and she gave him the simplest version of the truth. "I needed the work," she said, "and when I got here and saw those four on the porch steps, I needed to know they were going to be all right more than I needed to leave." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The same short nod he used to close subjects. But this time it felt different, like it was closing something he'd been holding open for a long time. He got up, said good night, and went upstairs. Rosalie sat at the kitchen table for a while longer with her grocery list and her too thin coat draped over the chair back, and she thought about the four children asleep upstairs, and the man who was trying to hold together something that had been cracking at the edges for over a year, and the house that smelled like cedar and old paint and biscuits now, and she thought, one more week. She thought that every week. By the time the trouble arrived from outside, she had been at Ashcroft Ranch for 6 weeks, and she had stopped counting. The trouble came on a Monday, which she would later think of as exactly the kind of day trouble picks: ordinary, unremarkable, a day when you haven't been bracing for anything. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Eli came running from the direction of the road, and Eli did not run unless something was wrong. He was 14 and had decided that running was something children did, and he had placed himself several inches above childhood, whether that was fair to him or not. "There's a man at the front," he said, a little out of breath. "Suit. Nice truck." She dried her hands on her apron. "Where's your dad?" "North pasture. Takes 20 minutes to get back." She went around to the front of the house. The man in the suit was named Barton Culhane. He was somewhere in his 50s, the kind of 50s that comes with expensive shoes, and the particular confidence of a man who is used to conversations going the way he wants them to go. He had a briefcase and a card holder and a truck that cost more than Rosalie had made in the last 2 years combined. He smiled at her the way a man smiles at someone he has already dismissed as inconsequential. "I'm looking for Gideon Ashcroft," he said. "He's not available right now. Can I help you?" "I'm Barton Culhane, First Harlan County Bank." He held out the card. "Mr. Ashcroft has an outstanding note on this property, and we need to discuss the terms going forward. There have been some—" He paused, choosing the word with care. "Restructuring opportunities I'd like to present to him." Rosalie took the card. She looked at it. "I'll let him know you stopped by." "It's a time-sensitive matter," Culhane said. His smile didn't change, but something around his eyes did. "The bank has some concerns about the viability of certain portions of the property as collateral, and it would be in Mr. Ashcroft's best interest to meet with us soon." He looked out at the pasture, slowly, the way a man looks at something he is already calculating the value of. Some of this back acreage, for instance. The bank might be interested in a partial liquidation arrangement, help him get out from under some of the debt. She stood very still on the porch steps. She had grown up in a house where money was talked around instead of about, where the word bank was said the way you say the name of a doctor who gave you a bad diagnosis. She knew exactly what partial liquidation arrangement meant. She knew what restructuring opportunities meant. She had watched her father talk to men like this in the kitchen of their house in Kansas, men with briefcases and smooth smiles, and she had watched him come out of those conversations smaller every time. "I'll tell him you stopped by," she said again. Her voice was level. "He'll be in touch." Culhane looked at her for a moment, really looked, the first time. "You the housekeeper?" "That's right." "Then maybe you should let the property owner handle his own business," he said, still smiling. She smiled back. "Absolutely," she said. "I'll have him call you." She turned and went back inside and closed the screen door behind her. Through the window, she watched him write something in a small notebook, get in his truck, and drive away. Then she went to find paper and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote down, from memory, everything he had said, every phrase, every implication, every word, because she knew from watching her father that the problem with men like Barton Culhane wasn't what they said out loud. It was everything they left between the lines, and she intended to read it. She didn't show Gideon the notes that evening. She waited. Not because she was afraid of his reaction. She had a reasonable sense by now of how he handled things, which was by going quiet and then handling them alone, which was precisely the problem. She waited because she needed to understand what she was looking at before she put it in front of him, and because a man like Gideon Ashcroft needed facts, not alarm. Give him alarm and he'd shut down. Give him facts and he'd act. She spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, going through what she remembered of Culhane's words, alongside what she found in a battered accordion folder she discovered in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk in the hallway. A drawer that Gideon had told her she could use for household papers, and which turned out to also contain, shoved to the back, a collection of bank correspondence that had clearly been placed there with the intention of not looking at it again. She read every letter, some of them twice. The ranch carried a note going back 11 years, taken out when Gideon and his wife had bought the additional East Pasture acreage. The original terms had been manageable, but there had been a refinancing 2 years ago, right around the time, she calculated, that his wife would have been getting sick, and the new terms were harder. The interest rate had adjusted. There was a balloon provision she'd had to read 3 times to fully understand, and when she understood it, she sat back in her chair and put her hand flat on the table and breathed slowly for a moment. The balloon payment came due in 8 months. She looked at the number. Then she looked at it again. It was not an impossible number, but it was not a comfortable number either, and it was certainly not a number Gideon was going to meet if he was selling cattle at current rates with current debt against him. What Culhane had called a partial liquidation arrangement, what he'd referred to so smoothly as helping Gideon get out from under, was, as far as she could read it, a mechanism by which the bank could acquire the East Pasture at below market value by making itself the only available buyer at a moment of financial pressure. She was not a lawyer. She was not a banker. She was a woman from Kansas who had watched her father get walked on by men with briefcases and had paid close attention to how it happened every single time. The how was always the same. You rushed the man. You presented the problem and the solution in the same breath, before he had time to think, before he had time to ask anyone else. You made the clock feel shorter than it was. You made him feel alone. She was not going to let Barton Culhane do that to Gideon Ashcroft. She put the papers back in order, made a neat stack, put a rubber band around it, and left it on Gideon's side of the kitchen table with a note on top that said, "When you have time. No rush, but sooner is better. R." She was in bed when she heard him come in, heard the chair scrape, heard the silence that meant he was reading. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. After about 40 minutes, she heard him get up, heard him stand in the hallway outside her door for a moment. She thought he was going to knock. He didn't. He walked back to the kitchen, and she heard the chair again, and then nothing, and she understood he was sitting in there with the papers and a weight he'd been carrying alone for a long time, and now, for the first time, someone else knew about it. She let him have that. Some things a person needs to sit with alone before they can talk about them. In the morning, he was already at the table when she came in at 5:15. He hadn't slept or hadn't slept much. She could see it in the set of his face. He had the papers in front of him and a mug of coffee he'd made himself, which was notable because in 6 weeks he had never been in the kitchen before she had the coffee going. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "How much of this do you actually understand?" he asked. He wasn't being dismissive. It was a real question. He wanted to know what he was working with. "Enough," she said. "The balloon payment in 8 months is the problem Culhane is trying to make into your solution. If he can get you panicked enough to sell off the East Pasture to the bank before you've had a chance to look at other options, the bank comes out well and you come out smaller." He looked at her across the table. "You got all that from the letters?" "And from watching what my father didn't do when men like Culhane came to our house." She kept her voice even. "He always heard them out before he had a chance to talk to anyone else. And by the time he talked to anyone else, he'd already halfway agreed." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What other options?" "That's the question we need to answer before you call Culhane back." She reached across and turned over the letter on the bottom of the stack. She'd put this one last deliberately. "There's a USDA farm loan program. I found the information at the library. It's specifically for family operations carrying debt on agricultural land. The interest rate is fixed and the terms are different from a private bank loan. It wouldn't fix everything, but it might give you leverage to renegotiate instead of liquidate." He picked up the letter she'd turned over and looked at it. "You went to the library," he said, "2 days ago, when you thought I took the truck to get flour." She paused. "I did get the flour." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to have something to show you before I told you. Didn't want to give you half an idea." He set the letter down. He looked at the window, the pale early light coming through. The ranch quiet outside. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head that had nothing to do with numbers. I don't like asking for help, he said. I know. From the government, especially. I know that too. But Culhane, he stopped, pressed his lips together. That man has been circling this property for 2 years, since before Margaret died. He knew the ranch was extended, and he knew I was distracted, and he has been very patient about it. She hadn't heard him say his wife's name before. Margaret. She filed it quietly. Then don't give him what he's been patient for, she said. He looked at her directly then. The way he'd looked at her that first evening across the kitchen table when he was figuring out what she was. She held the look without flinching. All right, he said. Show me what you found. That was the beginning of something between them that neither of them named. Not friendship exactly. It was too practical for that, too built on necessity. But a kind of partnership, quiet and functional, that neither of them had been looking for, and both of them, she thought, had needed more than they knew. They spent 2 mornings going through the papers together. She wrote down questions, and he answered the ones he could, and admitted when he couldn't. She organized the correspondence by date and type so he could see the sequence of decisions clearly. He called a man he knew in Abilene who dealt with the USDA program and spent an hour on the phone taking notes in his cramped handwriting on the back of a feed store receipt. He did not thank her, not in words. But one morning she came into the kitchen to find he had made coffee and left her mug already filled on the counter, which for Gideon Ashcroft was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Culhane called on a Thursday. She happened to be the one who answered. Miss Mercer, he said, is Mr. Ashcroft available? He is, she said. I'll get him for you. She went to the barn door and called for Gideon, and she stood in the kitchen doorway while he took the call, not to listen. She moved to the other side of the room, but because she wanted him to know someone was there. She heard his side of the conversation, short sentences, no rushing. He said he was aware of the payment schedule. He said he'd been reviewing his options. He said he'd be in touch when he had more information. He said it the way a man says things when he's no longer talking from a position of panic. When he hung up, he stood with his hand on the receiver for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at her. He didn't like that, Gideon said. No, she agreed. He wouldn't. He's going to push harder. Probably. She turned back to the counter and picked up the dish she'd been drying. But now he knows you're not going to move fast. That changes his options, too. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You think like this naturally? He asked. Or did somebody teach you? She thought about it honestly. My mother taught me that the first person to panic loses, she said. I just applied it. He nodded. He went back out to the barn. The USDA application took 3 weeks to put together properly. She helped him organize the documents, draft the supporting statement, calculate the figures. He was better with the numbers than she'd expected. He had a rancher's precision with livestock records and land valuation. But the paperwork itself was the kind of bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to discourage anyone who didn't already have a lawyer. They didn't have a lawyer. They had Rosalie's patience and Gideon's stubbornness and a borrowed reference book from the Haskell County Library. The application went in on a Wednesday in late April. They didn't celebrate. She made dinner. He came in from the field and washed up and sat down and ate with the children, and Owen talked about a bird's nest he'd found in the fence post along the south pasture, and Sam put a green bean on Rabbit's plate because Rabbit was apparently a vegetable enthusiast, and Cora argued with Eli about something so minor Rosalie had lost track of it before they'd finished the first sentence, and Gideon sat at the head of the table and ate his food and said very little, which was normal. But twice he looked down at the table with the particular look of a man counting something he thought he might have lost. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. After dinner, she was at the sink when Eli came in with his plate and stood next to her. Did you send something to the government? He asked, not looking at her, rinsing his plate the careful way he did everything. Your dad did, she said. I just helped with the paperwork. Eli was quiet for a moment. Is the ranch in trouble? She looked at him. He was 14 and he had been carrying the knowledge of trouble for so long without anyone confirming it that the question came out sounding almost relieved, like naming it was better than the weight of not naming it. Your dad is handling it, she said, and he's handling it the smart way. That's all I can tell you. Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and it was Gideon's nod, the same short, closing motion, which hit her somewhere in the middle of the chest in a way she wasn't prepared for. Okay, he said. He set his plate in the rack and went back to the living room. She stood at the sink for a moment longer than necessary before she got back to work. The trouble with Barton Colhane did not go away because they'd submitted an application and slowed things down. She had known it wouldn't. Men like Colhane had more than one tool in their kit, and when the direct approach didn't work, they found angles. She just hadn't predicted the specific angle he'd find. It came on a Friday in early May, and it came in the form of a woman named Darla Prentice from the Harlan County Child and Family Services Office, who pulled up to the ranch in a county vehicle at 10 in the morning while Gideon was in town at the feed store and the 3 older children were in school, and Sam was sitting on the kitchen floor building something complicated out of wooden spoons and Tupperware lids. Rosalie opened the door. Darla Prentice was a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses on a chain and a clipboard, and the specific expression of someone who has learned to keep her face very neutral because her job requires it. "I'm here regarding a welfare inquiry," she said, "concerning the minor children residing at this address. Is the parent or guardian home?" Rosalie felt something go cold and sharp in her chest. "He's in town. I expect him back within the hour. I'm the household. I take care of the children." She stepped back from the door. "Please come in." She brought Darla Prentice into the kitchen and offered coffee, which was refused, and sat across from her at the table with Sam on her lap, because Sam had seen the stranger and attached himself to Rosalie's side like a small, determined barnacle. "Can you tell me who made the inquiry?" Rosalie asked. "Complaints are anonymous," Darla said, though something in her voice suggested she understood the question's subtext perfectly well. "I'm required to investigate any filed concern about the welfare of minors. This is standard procedure." "What are the concerns?" Darla looked at her clipboard. "Neglect. Specifically, inadequate supervision, inadequate nutrition, and an unstable home environment following the death of the mother." She looked up. "These are the filed allegations. They don't represent the office's findings." Rosalie looked at Sam on her lap. He had stopped fidgeting and was leaning against her with the rabbit held across his chest, watching Darla Prentice with the wary attention of a child who has been in rooms where the adults were tense before. "The children go to school every day," Rosalie said. Her voice was steady. "They're fed properly. I cook every meal. They have clean clothes and their medical checkups are current. I can show you the pantry, the refrigerator, the children's rooms. I can give you the name of their doctor and their school attendance records." She kept her hands flat on the table. "What would you like to see first?" Darla Prentice looked at her for a long moment. Then she clicked her pen. "Let's start with the house," she said. Rosalie spent the next 40 minutes walking Darla Prentice through every room of that house, with Sam trailing behind them both, periodically showing Darla his rabbit, in case she needed to be reminded that the rabbit existed. She showed her the pantry, stocked, organized, labeled. The children's bedrooms, clean, evidence of children who did homework and had books and had space to themselves. The bathroom shared by Owen and Sam, she'd had a talk with Owen about soap 2 weeks ago, and it had stuck. She showed her Eli's room, with Darla's understanding that she hadn't been in there, but that Eli kept it himself and it was fine. She showed her the schedule on the refrigerator, the signed permission slips for Owen's upcoming field trip, the doctor's contact information on the corkboard by the phone. She explained the morning routine, the after-school routine, the dinner routine. She explained it not like a woman defending herself, but like a woman describing something she had built with care and was proud of. When they got back to the kitchen, Gideon's truck pulled into the yard. He came through the door and stopped when he saw the county vehicle through the window and Darla Prentice at his kitchen table. His face went still in a way that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of a man absorbing a hit and deciding how to respond to it. Rosalie spoke before he could. "Mr. Ashcroft, this is Darla Prentice from Child and Family Services. She's conducting a standard welfare inquiry." She held his eyes for just a moment, held them steady, telling him with everything except words, "I've handled the first part. Now it's your turn. Don't panic." I was quiet for just a beat. "All right," he said. He came to the table and sat down and answered every question Darla Prentice asked him in a measured, factual way that was the most controlled she had ever seen him, and she suspected it cost him more than it looked. After another half hour, Darla Prentice closed her clipboard, thanked them both for their cooperation, and said the office would follow up within 10 business days with a formal assessment. She shook Gideon's hand. She looked at Sam, who had fallen asleep on Rosalie's lap at some point in the last 20 minutes with the rabbit tucked under his chin. "He clearly feels safe," Darla said, and it came out quietly, like an observation she hadn't meant to make out loud. "He is safe," Rosalie said. Darla Prentice left. The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon sat at the table with his hands around his coffee mug. Rosalie had gotten him coffee at some point without quite noticing she'd done it, and he looked at the middle distance the way he did when he was working through something he hadn't finished yet. "It was Culhane," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think so." She shifted Sam slightly, careful not to wake him. "I can't prove it, but the timing is... it's him." His jaw was tight. "He can't get to the land directly, so he goes after the children. If the house is deemed inadequate, there's grounds for intervention, which becomes grounds for challenging my ability to manage the property on my own, which makes the bank's position..." He stopped. "This is a real estate play." "Yes," she said. "That's what I think too." He looked at her, at Sam asleep on her lap, at the kitchen around them, the stocked pantry, the schedule on the refrigerator, the dinner already partway prepped on the counter because she'd been working on it before Darla Prentice arrived. "If you hadn't been here when she came," he said. "I was here," she said simply. "So we don't need to think about that." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the light in the kitchen shifted. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. She wasn't sure what this referred to. She didn't ask. "None of this is easy for anyone," she said. "You're doing it anyway. That's the part that matters." He looked at her again, that direct measuring look that she'd gotten used to but that still had a weight to it. "Why do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Make things sound like they're going to be all right when you don't know if they are." She thought about it. "I don't say things are going to be all right," she said. "I try to say true things. The true thing right now is that the welfare officer saw a clean house and fed children and a little boy who felt safe enough to fall asleep in the middle of a stressful afternoon." She looked down at Sam. "That's not a performance. That's what we built here, and that's what the report is going to reflect." He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. Sam woke up 20 minutes later and slid off her lap and went to find a snack with the decisive energy of a 4-year-old who had slept for exactly the right amount of time, and the crisis, at least for the afternoon, folded itself back up. The formal assessment from Child and Family Services arrived 9 days later. Rosalie got to the mail first, not on purpose. She happened to be near the mailbox when the truck came by, and she carried the envelope inside and put it on the table and then went and found Gideon in the barn. "There's a letter," she said. He came inside, dried his hands, picked it up. She stood by the counter, not watching, giving him the space to read it alone. She heard the envelope open. A silence. Then a very quiet exhale. The kind a man lets out when he's been holding his breath for longer than he realized. "No findings of neglect," he said. "No recommended action. Case closed." She turned around. I was standing at the table holding the letter, and he looked, she had no other word for it, unmade, briefly. Not sad. Not relieved. Something rawer than either of those things. The expression of a man who has been braced for a blow for so long that when it doesn't come, the body doesn't quite know what to do. She didn't move toward him. She understood he didn't want that. "Good," she said. He set the letter down. He put both hands flat on the table. He breathed in once, slowly. Then he straightened and said, "I'm going to call the Herrera brothers about the fence on the east line. It needs to be done before the week's out." "I'll start dinner," she said. And they went about their day. The Herrera brothers were Manny and Julio, neighbors 3 miles down the county road, ranchers themselves with a spread that was smaller than the Ashcroft operation but tighter, the kind of place where everything worked because it was looked after. Gideon had known them for 15 years, since before he'd bought the East pasture, and they had the particular easy friendship of men who had worked alongside each other enough times that words weren't always necessary. They came the following Saturday with fence posts and wire in the bed of their truck, and Rosalie made a lunch she sent out with Eli at noon, sandwiches and cold sweet tea and a pan of cornbread, because she'd made it for dinner the night before and there was extra. Manny Herrera, who was the older of the two and who had a face like a friendly boulder, took the cornbread with both hands and said, "You the woman who's been keeping Ashcroft from going entirely feral?" She laughed, a real laugh, which surprised her a little. "That's one way to put it," she said. "He looks better," Manny said, not unkindly. "Past year he looked like a man walking around in a dream that wasn't going well. He's got his feet back under him." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just said she was glad, and took the empty pitcher back inside. but she stood in the kitchen for a moment after that. He's got his feet back under him. She turned that over. She had been thinking of what she did here as maintenance, keeping the machinery running, making sure the children were fed and cared for, managing the paperwork and the crises. It hadn't occurred to her to think of it as restoration, as giving someone back something they'd lost. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. It was a large thing to have done without quite meaning to. The spring shifted into early summer. The USDA application moved through its process. There were more forms. A site visit from a field officer named Mr. Patel, who wore the wrong shoes for a ranch and nearly went into the mud twice and was very gracious about both. And by June, there was a preliminary approval and a meeting scheduled with the lender to discuss modified terms. Culhane was not at the meeting. He sent a junior officer instead, which Rosalie took as information. Culhane was retreating to see what the new situation looked like before he came at it again. She didn't say this out loud. She kept it filed away. The children changed in ways that were hard to articulate, but easy to feel. Eli stopped eating with his shoulders up around his ears, the posture of someone expecting to be needed at any moment. He was still responsible. She didn't think anything would fully erase that out of him. It was too woven in by now. But there were evenings where he sat in the living room and just read, not watching the clock, not listening for his father's truck, just reading a book because he was 14 and it was summer and he could. Cora had arrived at a grudging détente with Rosalie that functioned, on Cora's terms, as follows. She would tell Rosalie things if she wanted to and not be pestered about things she didn't, and in return Rosalie would not attempt to be her mother. These terms were never stated out loud. They were just mutually understood, the way girls of 11 understand things without language. Rosalie kept her end precisely, which meant that Cora occasionally came and sat on the kitchen counter and talked about her friends at school, with a frankness that caught Rosalie off guard sometimes and made her work hard not to show it. Madison Hare at school said her mom thinks you're daddy's girlfriend, Cora said one evening, with the precise social reporting of an 11-year-old who is storing this information for future analysis. What did you say? Rosalie asked without looking up from the potatoes she was peeling. I said you're the housekeeper. A pause. That's what you are, right? That's the job I came here to do, yes. Cora was quiet for a moment. Madison's mom also thinks our house was a disaster before you came. Was it a disaster? Rosalie thought about the corners that hadn't been cleaned and the pantry that had been organized by fit rather than category, and the chair with the wire and electrical tape leg. It was a house full of people who were sad and busy and doing their best, she said. Cora seemed to turn that over. That's a nice way of saying yes, she said. Probably, Rosalie admitted. Cora almost smiled. She hopped off the counter and went to do her homework, and Rosalie went back to the potatoes and thought about the specific complicated thing it was to be in this house, the way it had settled around her without her quite deciding to let it, the way she had become somehow load-bearing in a structure that she had walked into as a temporary measure. Owen had started leaving her small things, a particularly smooth stone from the creek bed, a feather he thought was interesting, a drawing of what he said was the barn, but which looked more like a friendly rectangle with a triangle on top, and that she had taped to the inside of the cupboard door where she'd see it every time she got the coffee. He did this without comment and didn't require comment in return. It was just something he did, and she took each offering with the seriousness it deserved. Sam had started talking more. Not a flood of words. He wasn't that kind of child, she'd come to understand, but consistently more. He had opinions now that he expressed out loud. He thought the blue bowl was better than the yellow bowl for cereal. He thought Rabbit would like to see the baby calves, and had petitioned Gideon about this with a directness that Gideon had received with a straight face before telling Sam that Rabbit was welcome in the barn on Saturday. Gideon had taken Rabbit to the barn on Saturday. She'd seen it from the kitchen window. Gideon crouched down in the barn doorway, holding Sam up to see over the gate, Sam holding Rabbit, so Rabbit could see too, and she had turned back to the sink very quickly because she didn't want to be caught staring. She was aware that she was not supposed to be feeling what she was starting to feel. She was the housekeeper. She had $42 and a suitcase and a history of making choices based on someone else's version of things. She was practical enough to know the difference between a situation that moved you and a situation that was yours. She kept the distinction very firm in her mind. She kept it firm, and it kept shifting. It was Manny Herrera who broke something loose, though he didn't mean to. He came by on a Thursday evening to drop off a part Gideon had needed for the tractor, and he stayed for coffee, which turned into dinner because Rosalie made too much food as a matter of principle, and there was always room at the table. Manny ate 2 plates of the beef stew and said it was the best thing he'd eaten since his own wife's cooking, which made her ask about his wife, and he talked about her for 15 minutes. She'd passed 4 years ago, cancer, quick at the end, which was a mercy. And then he looked across the table at Gideon. Margaret used to say, Manny said, and the table got a little quieter when he said her name, that this ranch ran on stubbornness and the occasional miracle. He looked at his coffee mug. I think she'd say the same thing still. Gideon looked at the table, said nothing. Manny looked at Rosalie. She was a good woman. You would have liked each other, I think. Rosalie didn't know what to say to that. She said, she raised good children. She did, Manny said. But kids keep growing, and they need... He shrugged, the comfortable shrug of an older man who has watched enough life to say what he thinks without fretting about it. They need a house with 2 people in it who are paying attention. He said it simply, without implication, and then he asked Owen something about the baby calves, and the conversation moved on, and Rosalie got up to clear plates, and she didn't look at Gideon, and he didn't say anything, and the evening ended the way evenings did, with the children going to bed and the house settling into its nighttime sounds. She was washing the last of the dishes when she heard Gideon come back into the kitchen. She didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment. She could hear him working up to something. Rosalie, he said. That first week, when you said you'd stay 1 more week. A pause. Did you mean it? That you were only staying a week? She thought about it. About the blue suitcase in the small cedar-smelling room. About Sam's muffled crying through the wall and how she'd gone to make dinner without quite deciding to. I meant it when I said it, she said. What changed? She turned the water off. She stood there with her hand still in the sink for a moment. I don't think it was one thing, she said finally. I think it was just, you keep finding reasons to stay when the alternative is leaving. He was quiet. The children, she said. That was the main thing. That's still the main thing. I know, he said. His voice was careful, the way a man's voice is careful when he's building toward something and not sure of the ground. But I think you know that it's not... He stopped, started again. You changed something here, Rosalie, not just the pantry. She turned around. He was standing by the counter with his arms at his sides, and the particular expression of a man who has just said the truest thing he knows how to say and is not sure what happens next. She looked at him, at the tired eyes and the working man's hands, and the face that had started to look, in the last few weeks, slightly less like a man in a bad dream. Don't say anything you're going to take back in the morning, she said. Not unkindly. I won't, he said. She believed him. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that she believed him. He was a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. He just didn't say much. She looked at the dish towel in her hands. She looked at the corkboard with the children's doctor's number, and Owen's field trip permission slip, and the edge of the drawing she'd taped inside the cupboard. She looked at the kitchen that smelled like cedar and biscuits, and this family that had been breaking apart, and had, somehow, stopped. Let me think, she said. He nodded. That short nod. Good night, Gideon, she said. Good night, he said. She went to her small room and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands on her knees and the dark around her and the sound of the house. And she thought about everything she'd walked away from and everything she'd walked into and the fact that she hadn't planned any of this, not one piece of it, and that unplanned things scared her in a way planned things never did. But then she thought about Sam's rabbit. She thought about Eli's nod. She thought about Cora on the kitchen counter being honest with her because Rosalie had kept her end of an agreement nobody had put into words. She thought about Owen's drawing of the friendly rectangle barn, taped to the inside of the cupboard where she'd see it every morning. She sat in the dark for a long time, and she thought, you keep finding reasons to stay. Outside, across the flat West Texas dark, something called a nightbird, one she didn't know the name of but had been hearing for weeks now, its sound gone familiar as everything else here had gone familiar, and she lay down on top of the quilt without getting under it and listened to it until she couldn't anymore. She did not know yet what was coming. She didn't know that Culhane had one more move and that it would be the worst one. She didn't know that the next blow would not come from a bank or a welfare office, but from people who wore their money like a second skin and who believed, with the quiet certainty of people who had never been refused anything, that those 4 children could be taken from this house and placed into theirs, and that the law would help them do it. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew, lying in the dark in the small cedar-smelling room on the edge of a West Texas ranch, was that she was not getting on a bus. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was still true in its way, but because she had somewhere here. Something she had built with her hands and her patience and her mother's recipe for biscuits and her father's lesson about watching the second sentence of what a man with a briefcase says. Something that needed her to stay. She closed her eyes. She stayed. The letter came on a Wednesday, which was ordinary in every other way. Rosalie had gotten up at 5:15, made coffee, started biscuits, gotten Owen and Sam through breakfast, and put 2 lunches together for the school bus before she'd had time to think about anything beyond the immediate logistics of the morning. Gideon had been out since before dawn. One of the calves had gotten through a gap in the east fence in the night, and he'd gone out with Eli to find it, and they'd come back muddy and successful just in time for Eli to change his shirt and make the bus. It was a normal Wednesday. She'd stopped bracing for things in the way she had during those first weeks. That was her first mistake, she'd think later. You stopped bracing, and the thing you weren't bracing for arrived. The letter was in a heavy cream envelope with a return address from a law firm in Dallas, Whitmore, Baird and Associates, and it was addressed to Gideon in the formal way that legal correspondence is addressed, with his full name spelled out and the ranch address typed rather than handwritten. She put it on his side of the table with the rest of the mail and didn't think about it again until she heard him come in from the barn at noon. She heard him wash up. She heard him come to the kitchen. She heard the particular silence that followed, a silence with a texture to it, different from his normal quiet. And she turned around. He was standing at the table with the envelope open and 2 pages in his hand and the expression of a man who has been hit and is still figuring out where. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. His face was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something that wanted very badly to not be controlled. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. She sat. He put the letter on the table between them and pushed it toward her without speaking, and she read it. It took her 2 passes to understand the full shape of it, because the language was dense and deliberate in the way legal language is when it is trying to appear reasonable while doing something that is not. The letter was from Whitmore, Baird and Associates on behalf of their clients, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Aldrich of Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Aldrich, the letter established in its second paragraph, was the late Margaret Ashcroft's older sister. The letter expressed, in language so careful it felt almost polished, buffed smooth of anything that could be called accusation, the Aldriches' deep concern for the welfare of the 4 Ashcroft children following their mother's death 14 months prior. It referenced, without specifying, a pattern of instability in the children's living situation. It referenced the Child and Family Services inquiry, not its conclusion, just the fact of its existence. It referenced Gideon's financial circumstances in the vaguest possible terms, as a matter of documented public record. And then, in its 4th and final paragraph, it stated that the Aldriches would be filing a petition for custody of all 4 minor children in Harlan County District Court, and that they hoped to resolve the matter in a manner that prioritized, above all, the best interests and futures of the children. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "How long ago did Margaret's sister and you?" She started carefully. "We were never close." He said it in a way that meant there was a great deal more underneath it, and that the great deal more was not something he was ready to give words to right now. Douglas Aldrich has money. Old money. The Dallas kind. He has had opinions about this ranch and about me since before I married Margaret, and Margaret knew it, and we kept our distance. He picked the letter up and put it face down on the table, like turning it over would make it less real. We didn't keep enough distance, apparently. They mentioned the CFS inquiry. They mentioned it existed, not what it concluded. His jaw tightened. "Because the conclusion doesn't serve them." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at the letter face down on the table. "This is connected to Culhane." He looked at her. "I don't know that," she said quickly. "I can't prove it, but the inquiry was filed anonymously, and it referenced information about your financial situation that isn't public knowledge in any specific way. And now a Dallas law firm with the Aldriches as clients references the inquiry and your finances in the same breath." She kept her voice level. "That's 2 separate attacks using the same information. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the wall, but not at anything on the wall. That middle distance look, the calculating one. Culhane knows the Aldriches, he said slowly. I knew that. He's done work for Dallas money before. Property work. He stopped. Margaret's sister always hated this ranch. She thought Margaret threw herself away on a man with land and no future. When Margaret got sick, Eleanor, Mrs. Aldrich, came out and spent a week and said things to Margaret that I will not repeat. And then she left and we didn't see her again until the funeral. And at the funeral, she told me that those children deserved better than what I could give them. His voice was very controlled. I told her to get off my property. Rosalie sat very still. She's been waiting, she said. She's been waiting, he agreed. The silence settled in the kitchen between them, like weather. Outside, through the window, the summer afternoon went about its business. A crow on the fence post, the far pasture, pale gold in the heat. The sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. None of it cared about the cream-colored letter or the Dallas law firm or the 4 children who were right now in school believing their lives were ordinary. Gideon, she said, you need a lawyer. I know. Not in Haskell, someone who has handled custody cases. Family law. I know. He said it again, and this time there was something underneath it. Not resistance, exactly, but the particular weight of a man calculating what things cost against what he has. She understood it without him saying it. The USDA application had helped with the bank situation, but helped wasn't the same as resolved. And a Dallas law firm meant Dallas law firm rates on the other side of the table. Let me find some options, she said, before you worry about the cost. Let me find out what's available. He looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. And then, because she was tired of both of them pretending that the situation here was simpler than it was. Let me help you. Let me actually help. He held her gaze for a moment. He nodded. She drove to the Haskell County Library the next morning while Sam was at the neighbor's place for a play date that Owen had arranged with the fussy efficiency of an 8-year-old who had decided his brother needed socialization. She spent 2 hours at the computer researching family law attorneys within reasonable distance, making a list of 4. And then she called all 4 from the payphone in the library lobby because she didn't want to have the conversation on the kitchen phone where children could walk in. 2 of the 4 were too expensive to be realistic. One was so new to practice that she didn't feel confident. The 4th was a woman named Helen Garza, based in Abilene, 40 years old, who had been practicing family law for 14 years, and whose office, when Rosalie called, was answered by Helen Garza herself because her receptionist was at lunch. She had a direct way of speaking that Rosalie appreciated immediately. She asked 3 questions: the filing party, the stated grounds, and the jurisdiction. And then she said, bring me the letter and whatever documentation you have on the household. I'll give you an hour consultation and tell you what you're looking at. They drove to Abilene the following Saturday, Rosalie and Gideon, while Manny Herrera watched the children with the amiable competence of a man who had raised 3 of his own and was no longer intimidated by anything a small person could do. Gideon drove and didn't talk much, which was normal, but there was a tightness in him that she could feel across the cab of the truck, a person held together by force of will, and she didn't try to ease it because sometimes ease is the wrong thing. Helen Garza's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Cypress Street, plain and clean, with the kind of organized clutter that meant someone worked seriously in here rather than just passed through. Helen herself was a compact woman with short hair and reading glasses she kept taking on and off, and a directness that made Rosalie trust her within the first 4 minutes. She read the letter. She asked Gideon questions, not soft ones. She asked about the CFS inquiry and its conclusion, and he produced the clearance letter, which she set aside with a small nod that meant something. She asked about his financial situation, and he answered honestly, more honestly than Rosalie had expected, laying out the USDA situation and the balloon payment and the current standing without flinching. She asked about Eleanor Aldrich and the history there, and he was briefer but still honest. Then she sat back and took her glasses off and looked at them both. The petition doesn't have strong legs, she said. Not on the merits. A cleared welfare investigation, 4 kids in school, a stable household. She glanced at Rosalie. With consistent care. That's not a picture of neglect. But the Aldriches have resources, and a well-funded case can make a stable household look unstable if they get enough time and the right judge. She paused. The financial documentation is going to be the thing they lean on. They'll argue that the ranch is financially precarious, and that the children's long-term stability requires a more secure environment. They'll bring in expert witnesses on child welfare. They'll make this expensive and slow. Gideon was looking at the table. How expensive? She told him. The number was not catastrophic, but it was real, and she watched it land on him. And on their side? Rosalie asked. Whitmore and Baird are very good, Helen said flatly. They don't lose often, but they also tend to win by attrition. They outlast people, not out-argue them. She put her glasses back on. The strongest thing you have is the household itself. Consistent care, clean clearance, children who are demonstrably stable. If we can document that thoroughly and get it in front of the right judge before the Aldriches establish their narrative, we have a real case. She looked at Gideon. I need you to not do anything to give them ammunition. No missed school days, no financial decisions that look panicked, no... She paused, and Rosalie saw her choose the next words carefully. Instability in the household situation. Gideon looked up. What does that mean? Helen looked between them. It means the household as currently constituted needs to remain as currently constituted, documented, and stable. If there are any changes, she left it there, professionally, and the space she left was shaped exactly like the conversation Rosalie and Gideon had been not quite having for the past 3 weeks. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the sun going flat and orange over the flat Texas country, and neither of them said much for the first 40 miles. She watched the land go by and thought about what Helen had said, and about the 4 children at the ranch with Manny Herrera, and about the Aldriches in their Dallas house, waiting. She's right about the household, Gideon said finally. He was looking at the road. I know. If they can make you look like... He stopped, started differently. If they can characterize the situation as irregular, an unrelated woman living in the house, no formal relationship to the family. He was choosing each word the way you choose where to step in uncertain ground. I know what they can do with it, she said. She'd been thinking about it since Helen's office. I'm not saying that's a reason. His hands were even on the wheel. I'm not trying to use this situation to... He stopped entirely. She turned and looked at him. The profile of him, the straight line of his jaw, and the way he looked at the road instead of her when he was saying something he couldn't quite get to. Gideon, she said, what are you trying to say? I'm trying to say that 3 weeks ago I said something to you, and you told me not to say anything I'd take back in the morning, and I haven't taken it back. He said it all in one breath, flat and quick, the way a man says something he's been going over in his head for a while. And I'm trying to say that what I want to ask you has nothing to do with the legal situation, and I don't want you to confuse the two. She sat with that for a moment. I don't confuse things, she said. I know you don't. He glanced at her. That's why I'm trying to be careful. She looked out at the flat gold road ahead. Ask me, she said. I was quiet for a moment longer. Then, would you... He stopped, and for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something uncertain in his voice, something that hadn't been managed into flatness before it came out. Is there any chance that you would want to stay, permanently, as part of the family? He said family carefully, like the word had been examined for traps first. Not because of the court case, because I don't want to spend the next year hoping you're going to still be there when I come in at night. The truck's engine ran. The road went on ahead of them. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about what she'd told herself, about the distinction between a situation that moved you and a situation that was yours. She thought about how firmly she'd kept that distinction, and she thought about how entirely it had failed to hold. I have $42 and a second-hand suitcase, she said. I came here to do housekeeping for a man I'd spoken to on the phone for 90 seconds. I know, he said. I'm not who anyone would plan. I know that too. A pause. I'm not who anyone would plan either. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. No, she said. You're really not. He didn't say anything. He waited, because that was what he did. He said a thing, and then he waited, without pushing, without filling the silence. She had learned to read that patience of his as a form of respect. He wasn't going to talk her into anything. She thought about Eli's nod. She thought about Sam and Rabbit. She thought about Cora on the kitchen counter being honest with her. She thought about Owen's drawing of the friendly rectangle barn taped to the inside of the cupboard, and about Manny Herrera saying he's got his feet back under him, and about the night she'd lain on top of the quilt listening to the bird she didn't know the name of. Yes, she said. He exhaled once, slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Okay, okay," she said. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was different from all the other silences between them. Not heavy, not empty. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have just moved something large together and are still feeling where it landed. The children needed to be told, and the telling was its own kind of careful thing. They told Eli first, alone, because Eli deserved that. Gideon brought him into the living room after dinner, and Rosalie sat in the chair across from the couch where Eli settled with his arms on his knees, already alert, already reading the room the way he always did. Gideon said it plainly, the way he said everything, that he had asked Rosalie to stay as his wife, and that she had said yes, and that he wanted Eli to hear it from him directly. Eli looked at his father. Then he looked at Rosalie. His face was doing the arithmetic of a 14-year-old working through something more complicated than arithmetic. "Does this have to do with the legal stuff?" he said. He'd overheard the name Whitmore Baird. She'd seen him clocking it in the way he clocked everything. "There are legal complications," Gideon said. "That's true, but that's not why." He said it simply. "I want you to know the difference." Eli looked at Rosalie again. She met his eyes and didn't say anything, because this wasn't a moment for her to explain. It was a moment for him to decide what he thought. After a long pause, Eli said, "Are you good with it? Being here, long term?" He was asking her, not his father. "Yes," she said. "I wouldn't have said yes otherwise." He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "Okay," he said. The same word, the same short nod, but she understood him well enough by now to know that this okay was not dismissal. It was a door opening. Cora was harder. Not because she was hostile. She wasn't, not exactly. But because Cora had an 11-year-old's understanding of what it meant for a woman to replace her mother. And that understanding was fierce and complicated and real. And Rosalie had no intention of dismissing it. Cora heard the news with her arms crossed and her chin out, which was her default position when things were requiring more from her than she was sure she could give. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're not my mother." "No," Rosalie said. "I'm not. And I'm not going to try to be." "Then what are you going to be?" "I'm going to be exactly who I've been since March. Someone who's here, who keeps the house, who makes your biscuits, who you can talk to if you want and don't have to if you don't." She kept her voice even. "Nothing about that changes." Cora's jaw worked. Something was moving behind her eyes that she was not going to let out, not here. "What if I hate it?" she said. "Then you tell me," Rosalie said. "Straight out, and we figure it out." "What if I can't stand it and you stay anyway?" "Then I'll be here, and I'll be someone you can be honest with about how much you can't stand it." She paused. "Cora, I'm not asking for your blessing, but I would like someday for you to not hate this." Cora looked at her for a long moment. The chin came down a fraction of an inch. "I don't hate you," she said. It sounded like it cost her something. "I know," Rosalie said. Owen said, "Does that mean you live here forever?" With the uncomplicated directness of an 8-year-old for whom forever was a simple and appealing concept, and when Rosalie said yes, he nodded with great satisfaction and went back to his book. Sam, when told, considered the information for a moment, then picked up Rabbit and handed him to Rosalie for a visit. She understood this was a significant endorsement. She held Rabbit with both hands, seriously, and handed him back. The wedding was a small thing, quick and practical, at the county courthouse in Haskell on a Thursday morning in late June. Manny Herrera and his wife Carmen came as witnesses. The children dressed in their Sunday clothes, and Owen's collar was crooked and she straightened it in the parking lot while he held perfectly still in the way children hold still when they are being cared for and know it. Cora wore her hair loose and said nothing during the ceremony. But afterward, in the parking lot, while Gideon was talking to Manny and the boys were poking at something in a crack in the asphalt, she came and stood beside Rosalie. "You look nice," Cora said. Not warmly, but honestly. "So do you," Rosalie said. Cora pressed her lips together. Then she said, "I don't want to call you Mom." "You don't have to." "Okay." And she walked away to stand with her brothers, and Rosalie watched her go and thought, one day at a time, that's all, one at a time. They told Helen Garza, who had already been working on the documentation package for the custody response, and whose voice on the phone conveyed nothing but professional assessment. "That changes the household picture significantly. I'll note the marriage date and amend the filing. Send me the license copy when you have it." She paused. This is good. For the case. I know, Rosalie said. That's not why we did it. I didn't say it was, Helen said. I'm just telling you it helps. The petition from the Aldrich's attorneys arrived formally 3 weeks after the wedding, and it was everything Helen had warned them about. Dense and careful and structured to plant seeds of doubt at every turn. It cited the CFS inquiry. It cited Gideon's financial situation, with specifics that could only have come from Culhane's bank, which confirmed what Rosalie had suspected about the connection between them. It characterized the household as having gone through a period of severe neglect and instability, and it included a character reference from a woman named Ruth Fells, a neighbor of the Aldriches in Dallas, who had apparently visited the ranch twice in the years before Margaret died, and who was prepared to testify that she had observed concerning signs of parental inadequacy. Rosalie read every page of it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she felt the anger come up in her. Not the hot, immediate kind, but the colder, steadier kind that settles in and stays and makes you methodical. She pulled out a legal pad. She started making notes. She wrote down every allegation. She wrote down what documentation existed to counter each one. She wrote down what documentation didn't exist yet but could be gathered. She wrote down the name Ruth Fells and underlined it twice because she wanted to know everything about what Ruth Fells had observed and when and under what circumstances. And she had a strong instinct that Ruth Fells had been coached in what to remember. She was 3 pages into the legal pad when Gideon came in from the porch, where he'd been sitting since she started reading. He'd read it first, quickly, and then gone outside, which was what he did when he needed to process something at a distance from other people. He came and stood at the counter and looked at the legal pad. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Turning it into a problem you can solve." She looked up. "Isn't that what it needs to be right now?" "Yes." He looked at her. "I'm not criticizing. He rubbed his hand over his face, the tired gesture that she'd come to understand as the one he used when the control was slipping just slightly. "I want to kill Douglas Aldrich," he said very quietly. "I want to find the connection between him and Culhane, and I want to walk into a room and put it on a table in front of both of them, and—" He stopped. "And? I don't know. I just want them to have to look at what they did." He sat down across from her. "Margaret's sister standing up in a courtroom and telling a judge that I'm not capable of raising my own children. Margaret's children." His voice was flat and even, and underneath it was something she recognized as the specific grief of a man who has lost a person and is now also losing the version of the future they had planned together. "She would have hated this," he said. "Margaret. She would have hated what Eleanor is doing." "I believe that," Rosalie said. "Eleanor always wanted the children near her, since before they were born. Margaret used to say—" He stopped, and something moved across his face that he didn't quite manage to contain. And she saw it and didn't look away, because she decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to look away from his grief just because it was uncomfortable to see. She used to say that Eleanor loved things she could arrange, people the same as flowers. Put them where they look right. He shook his head. "Those kids are not going to Dallas." "No," Rosalie said. "They're not." He looked at the legal pad. "What do you have so far?" She pushed it across the table. He read for a while. She watched him read, watched him slow down at certain pages and move faster through others, watched him stop at the section about Ruth Fells. "I don't trust that name," he said. "Neither do I. I want to find out when exactly she visited, and I want to pull the school attendance records for those dates. If the kids were in school and the house was running normally during both her supposed visits, that's something." He looked at her. "How did you get so good at this?" "At what?" "Finding the seams in things, where they come apart." She thought about it honestly. "I think I got good at it because I spent a long time not being good at it and learning what that cost," she said. "I trusted people I shouldn't have trusted because I wanted to believe what they were telling me. And when that stopped working, I started paying attention to what didn't fit." I was quiet for a moment. "Mark," he said. She told him about Mark in pieces over the months, the way you tell someone things when you're in the same house long enough that telling becomes natural. "Among other people," she said. He looked at her, the direct way, the one that still had weight in it. "For what it's worth," he said. "You fit here." She looked at the table. "I know," she said. It came out quieter than she meant. Helen Garza's first filing landed in the Harlan County District Court on a Friday in early July, and it was, as Helen had promised, thorough. It included the CFS clearance letter, the children's school attendance records for the past 8 months. Perfect, or near enough. One absence for Owen's ear infection. The pediatric records showing all 4 children current on checkups and growing normally. Character statements from Manny and Carmen Herrera, from the children's school principal, from the Haskell County librarian who had seen Rosalie there enough times to have a formed opinion about the kind of person she was, and from 2 other neighbors who had watched this household from a distance and were willing to say what they'd seen. It also included a formal objection to the Aldrich's use of the CFS inquiry as evidence of instability given its documented conclusion, and a request that the court note the timing of the petition relative to ongoing business disputes involving a third party with documented connections to Mrs. Aldrich's husband. Helen called after the filing went in. Whitmore and Baird will respond within 30 days, she said. They'll try to schedule the hearing fast before we've had time to build more documentation. I'm going to request a 60-day discovery period. Will you get it? Probably. Maybe 45. Depends on the judge. A pause. The judge is Margaret Wallace. She's been on the family court bench for 11 years. She doesn't like procedural games, and she doesn't like money being used as a substitute for parenting. That works in our favor. Has she seen cases like this before? Oh, yes, Helen said, and her voice had a particular dryness in it. She has seen wealthy relatives try to take children away from adequate parents before, and she has opinions about it. I'm not going to promise anything, but I'm not scared of this judge. Rosalie held the phone for a moment after Helen hung up. She went to the kitchen and put water on for tea and stood at the counter while she waited for it to boil and thought about Eleanor Aldrich, whom she had never met, who had told a dying woman that the man she loved was not good enough for her children, who had stood at a funeral and looked at a grieving father and decided what she saw was an opportunity. She tried to understand it, not excuse it, just understand it. She'd found that you could manage your anger better if you understood what was driving the thing that made you angry. Eleanor Aldrich, from everything Gideon had told her, and from everything the legal filings implied, was a woman who expressed love as control. She wanted the children near her because she loved them in the way certain people love, by owning, by arranging, by deciding they knew best and acting accordingly. She probably had not examined that closely enough to see it for what it was. People like that usually hadn't. It didn't make her less dangerous. It made her more, in a way, a person who is convinced of their own righteousness fights differently than a person who knows they're wrong. The kettle boiled. She poured the tea. Cora came into the kitchen in her pajamas, which meant it was after 9 and she'd stayed up reading past when she was supposed to. Rosalie didn't mention it. "Can I have some?" Cora said, nodding at the tea. "It's late." "I know." She pulled out a chair. Rosalie got another mug. She poured the tea and put it on the table in front of Cora and sat down across from her. Cora wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it. "Is it bad?" Cora said. "The stuff with the Aldriches." Rosalie looked at her. "Where did you hear about that?" "I'm not stupid. I hear things." She looked up. "Eli told me there was a custody thing. He didn't give me details." A pause. "Is someone trying to take us away?" She made the decision quickly and clearly. She was not going to lie to this girl. Cora was 11, and she was sharp, and she had already been through enough to earn the truth, told carefully. "Someone is trying," Rosalie said. "We are fighting it. Helen Garza, who is our attorney, is very good, and we have a strong case." She held Cora's eyes. "I want you to hear me say this plainly. Nobody is taking you anywhere, not without a fight that I'm going to be in all the way. Do you understand?" Cora looked at her. Her chin was doing the thing it did, the held-in thing, and her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was managing something. "Why?" she said. "You weren't supposed to be here. You just answered an advertisement." "I know," Rosalie said. "So why do you care this much?" It was a real question, genuinely meant. The kind of question only an 11-year-old asks because adults have learned not to, have learned to assume the answer or not need one. Rosalie sat with it for a moment. "Because you're mine now," she said simply. "All 4 of you. Not like your mother was yours. I know that. But mine in the way that matters. And what's mine, I protect." Cora looked at the table. One tear, very quick, which she wiped with the back of her hand in a motion so fast Rosalie had to decide whether she'd seen it or not. She decided she hadn't. "The biscuits," Cora said after a moment. "What about them?" "Mom's were better." She said it almost belligerently, braced for the reaction. "I know they were," Rosalie said. I'll keep trying. The corner of Cora's mouth moved. Just barely. Not quite a smile, but the motion in the direction of one. She finished her tea and went to bed. Rosalie sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, alone, with the house quiet around her, and the legal pad on the counter, and outside the flat Texas dark, that bird calling again from wherever it was. She thought about the hearing ahead of them, which Helen had said could be 45 days or 60, which meant it was coming regardless of how much she or Gideon or Helen worked to prepare. She thought about Eleanor Aldrich and Douglas Aldrich and Whitmore, Baird and Associates, and the specific machinery of money applied to the project of taking 4 children away from the only life they had. She thought about Ruth Fells and the school attendance records, and she added a note to the legal pad. Ask Helen about deposition for RF, dates of visits specific. She thought about the judge, Margaret Wallace, who had been on the family court bench for 11 years and had seen wealthy relatives try this before. She thought about Gideon's face in the truck on the way back from Abilene, saying, I don't want to spend the next year hoping you're going to still be there when I come in at night. She thought about this fact that she was sitting in this kitchen at 10:15 on a Thursday, planning how to keep a family together that wasn't hers 3 months ago and was entirely hers now, and that this was who she had turned out to be. Not who she'd planned, not who anyone had expected, but exactly who this situation had required and who she, it turned out, was capable of being. She added 3 more notes to the legal pad. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed and she slept, and in the morning she got up at 5:15 and made coffee and started the biscuits. And outside the ranch was still there, and the children were still there. And Gideon's boots were outside the mudroom door the way they always were. And everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. The hearing was coming. She knew what was on the other side of it. She knew it wouldn't be clean or easy or without cost. She had stopped needing things to be clean or easy a long time ago. She just needed them to hold. The 45 days before the hearing were the longest Rosalie had ever lived through, and she had lived through some long ones. It wasn't that each individual day was unbearable. Most of them were ordinary on the surface. Breakfast at 6:30, school bus at 7:15, the ranch running on its rhythm of feeding and mending, and the 1,000 small repairs that a working property constantly required. Gideon in the field, Owen collecting things, Sam and Rabbit conducting their quiet business, Eli doing his homework at the kitchen table with the focused silence of a boy who had decided that being useful was the best thing he could be and who was slowly learning that he was allowed to just be 14 sometimes. Cora had started teaching herself to make biscuits. She didn't announce it. She just showed up in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, stood next to Rosalie at the counter and said, without preamble, "Show me what you do with the butter." Rosalie showed her. She showed her the way her mother had shown her, hands in the flour, working cold butter until it was the right texture, not talking too much about it, because biscuit making was mostly feel and feel couldn't be fully explained. Cora watched and then tried, and her first attempt came out a little flat on one side because she twisted the cutter, which pressed the layers together and stopped the rise, and Rosalie told her that and showed her why without making it a lesson, just a fact. They weren't perfect. Gideon ate 2 of them without saying anything until Owen asked, "Were the biscuits different today?" And Gideon said Cora had made them, and Owen said they were good, and Cora looked at her plate with something on her face that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the neighborhood of it. These were the things Rosalie held on to during the 45 days. The ordinary things. Because the other thread running underneath every ordinary day was Helen Garza calling with updates and requests, documents needed, dates confirmed, and the particular dread that comes with waiting for something you can't stop and can only prepare for. Helen had gotten the school attendance records and the pediatric files organized into a coherent timeline. She had deposed Ruth Fells, which had gone, in Helen's dry summary, about as well as I expected. Ruth Fells had been to the ranch twice, both times before Margaret's death, both times as a social visit accompanying Eleanor Aldrich. Under questioning, she had been unable to specify any particular instance of neglect she had personally witnessed. She had seen disorder. She had seen a house that was, in her words, not well maintained. Helen had pointed out that both visits had occurred during the period when Margaret Ashcroft was receiving cancer treatment, and had asked Ruth Fells whether she considered it surprising that a household with a terminally ill parent might show signs of strain. Ruth Fells had said that was a fair point, in the way people say things when they're embarrassed by them. "She's not going to be their strongest witness," Helen said, "but they'll still put her on. She's sympathetic looking and she'll cry on cue, which matters to some juries. There's no jury in family court, Rosalie said. No, Helen agreed. But judges are human. Presentation matters. The Aldrich's legal team had submitted their witness list, and it was longer than expected. In addition to Ruth Fells, there was a child psychologist named Dr. Marcus Webb from Dallas, whom Helen identified as a professional expert witness who appeared in custody cases with enough frequency that she had a file on him. There was a financial analyst prepared to testify about the ranch's debt structure. And there was Eleanor Aldrich herself, who would testify as petitioner. She's going to be their centerpiece, Helen said. Grieving sister, concerned aunt, woman who loved Margaret and wants to honor her memory by ensuring the children are properly cared for. Her voice was flat. She's probably been preparing for this for months. What do we do about her? We let her testify and we cross-examine her very carefully. A pause. I want you on the stand, Rosalie. I want your testimony before hers. I want the judge to have a picture of that household before Eleanor Aldrich tries to paint a different one. Rosalie had been expecting this, and had been not thinking about it simultaneously, which was the only way she knew to handle things she was afraid of. What do I say? The truth. What you saw when you arrived, what you did, what the children are like now. I'll walk you through it, but I need you to be... Helen paused. I need you to be yourself. Not composed, not performing competence, yourself, with whatever that looks like. I'm not sure what that looks like, Rosalie said honestly. I think you're more sure than you think, Helen said. The night before the hearing, Rosalie couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark at 2 a.m. and listened to Gideon breathing beside her and thought about the courtroom she'd seen on the day Helen had taken her to the courthouse to walk through it. A room that smelled like old wood and legal paper and the specific gravity of decisions. She thought about the judge, Margaret Wallace, whom she had not yet seen but whose reputation she'd been absorbing secondhand through Helen's comments. She thought about Eleanor Aldrich, whom she also had not seen but had built a picture of from Gideon's descriptions and from the filings. A woman in her mid-50s, Dallas money, a house in Highland Park, no children of her own, who had stood at her sister's funeral and looked at 4 grieving children and decided what she saw was something she could fix by rearranging it. Gideon spoke in the dark, which startled her. You're thinking loudly, he said. Sorry. Don't be. A pause. He shifted. What is it? I keep going through what I'm going to say on the stand. What are you going to say? The truth. She stared at the ceiling. I keep thinking about the parts of the truth that could be used wrong. I came here for work. I needed the money. I stayed because... She stopped. Because why? You know why. I do, he said. But say it out loud. Practice. She was quiet for a moment. I stayed because those 4 children were the most important thing in that house and someone needed to be there for them. She said it into the dark. Not instead of you, alongside you. That's true. Yes. She pressed her hands flat against her stomach. But a lawyer from Whitmore and Baird is going to make it sound like I was a hired hand who married the employer for convenience. Let them try, Gideon said. He said it quietly, but there was something in it that was not quiet at all. A steadiness that she had come to know as the thing underneath his silences, the actual substance of him. Rosalie, look at me. She turned her head. In the dark she could make out the line of him, the serious face looking at her. I know why you stayed, he said. My kids know why you stayed. Helen Garza is going to make sure the judge knows why you stayed. And if Eleanor Aldrich's lawyers try to make it into something else, they're going to be doing it in front of a woman who has seen every version of this before and knows the difference. He held her eyes. You are the most capable person I have ever met. I need you to act like it tomorrow. She breathed in, out. You're better at this than I thought you'd be, she said. The saying the right thing. I have my moments. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but almost. She slept eventually. Not deeply and not long, but enough. The morning of the hearing, she got up at 5:15, same as always. She made coffee. She made biscuits, Cora's recipe now as much as hers, and she set them on the table, and she got the children up, and she made sure Owen's collar was straight and Sam's shoes were tied in the double knot he needed because single knots came undone and he'd trip on the lace. She made sure Eli ate something because Eli had the same tendency she did to forget breakfast when he was anxious, and he was 14 and needed the fuel whether he thought so or not. Manny and Carmen Herrera came at 7:30 to take the children for the day. Carmen hugged Rosalie in the way that older women hug when they know the thing is serious. Not tight enough to feel like pity, but substantial. Manny shook Gideon's hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake required. Sam waved at them from the Herrera truck with Rabbit doing the wave too. And that image, Sam's hand and the rabbit's paw against the truck window, was the one Rosalie carried into the courthouse with her. The Harlan County Courthouse was a low limestone building that looked like it had been determined to outlast everything around it and had largely succeeded. The courtroom was on the second floor, dark wood paneling and high windows, and the smell she'd memorized on the walkthrough, old wood and paper and gravity. Helen was already there when they arrived, in a charcoal suit with a rolling case of files and the calm expression of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. "How are you?" Helen said to Rosalie. "Ready," Rosalie said, which was not entirely true but was the closest available truth. "Good." Helen looked at Gideon. "Both of you sit straight. Don't react to anything they say. If something makes you angry, look at me. I'll handle it." The Aldriches came in with their legal team at 9:15. Douglas Aldrich was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who owned rooms by walking into them. Eleanor Aldrich was smaller than Rosalie had expected, a fine-boned woman in a dark blue dress with Margaret's coloring, which was a strange thing to see, Margaret's coloring on a woman who was trying to take Margaret's children. She sat down at the petitioner's table without looking at Gideon, which Rosalie clocked and filed. The judge entered. Margaret Wallace was in her late 50s, a woman with a face that had not softened with age so much as settled, the bones more visible, the eyes more settled into themselves, more precise. She called the room to order with a voice that did not require volume to have authority, and the room responded immediately, which told Rosalie something about how proceedings in this courtroom typically went. The opening arguments were a study in contrast. The Aldrich's lead attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, was skilled in the way that very expensive attorneys are skilled, precise language, emotional undercurrent managed carefully, every word placed like a chess piece. He painted a picture of 4 grieving children in a household that had struggled significantly after their mother's death, of a father overwhelmed by debt and grief, of a situation that had required intervention from child welfare services. He referred to Rosalie as a woman employed by Mr. Ashcroft, and to the marriage as a recent and expedient legal arrangement. He said all of this pleasantly, without apparent malice, which was worse than malice would have been. Helen's opening was shorter. She said the evidence would show 4 healthy, thriving children in a stable home with 2 parents who had built something real under difficult circumstances. She said the petition was not about the children's welfare, but about a family disagreement being prosecuted through the court system. She said the court would hear from the children's doctors, their teachers, their neighbors, and from the woman who had been present in that household every day for the past 8 months, and that the picture those witnesses painted would be a clear one. The judge listened to both openings with the same expression, attentive, neutral, giving nothing away. Rosalie was called to the stand at 10:40. She walked to the witness stand and sat down and looked out at the courtroom, at Gideon at the defense table, sitting straight the way Helen had told him, at the Aldrich's table, where Eleanor was watching her with an expression Rosalie couldn't immediately read, at Helen, who gave her one small nod. Helen's direct examination took 40 minutes. She walked Rosalie through the chronology, the advertisement, the arrival, the first week, the household as she'd found it, and as she'd worked to change it. She asked about the children specifically, by name, and Rosalie answered about each one with the particularity that came from 8 months of daily attention. She knew Owen's habits and Sam's and Eli's and Cora's, the way you know things you have paid careful attention to because they mattered. She didn't describe them as perfect. She said that Eli had been carrying too much for too long and that she'd worked to put it down for him. She said that Sam had taken weeks to talk to her, and that when he did, it was with the carefulness of a child who had learned that not everyone stayed, and that she had worked every day to be someone he could trust to stay. She said that Cora had a grief that was real and complicated, and that she had not tried to replace it or minimize it, but simply to be present alongside it. She said all of this in her own voice, which was not composed in any performance sense. It was just her voice, slightly rough with something she wasn't going to call emotion in front of a courtroom, saying true things about 4 children she would not allow to be moved from the life they knew. Helen asked her why she had stayed beyond the initial week. She looked at the judge when she answered, not at Helen, not at the table, at Judge Wallace. Because those children needed someone who wasn't going to leave, she said. Their mother left. Not by choice, not because she wanted to, but she left. And I could see in every one of them the fear that the next person would leave too. I wasn't going to be another person who left. Helen asked if her marriage to Gideon Ashcroft had been motivated by the custody case. No, she said. He asked me before the petition was filed, before we knew the Aldriches were planning this. She paused. And I said yes because it was true what I felt, not because it was convenient. Helen said she had no further questions and sat down. Gerald Whitmore stood up. She had been prepared for his cross-examination in the way that Helen could prepare her, which was to say, thoroughly and imperfectly, because preparation is not the same as the real thing. Whitmore was skilled, and he moved through the first section smoothly, establishing the basic facts of her employment, her financial situation at arrival, the timeline of her relationship with Gideon. You arrived at the Ashcroft Ranch with $42, he said. Not a question. A statement laid out for the courtroom. Yes, she said. You had no other employment prospects at the time? No. So this position, room, board, and salary, represented the entirety of your financial stability. At the time, yes. And within 8 months of taking that position, you married your employer. He said it without inflection. You went from employee to wife in 8 months. I went from stranger to wife in 8 months, she said, which is what happens when you're in the same house with people every day and you pay attention to who they are. He moved on quickly, which told her the answer had not been useful to him. He went to the CFS inquiry, asking about the welfare visit, the allegations, the nature of the investigation. Helen had prepared her for this section specifically. You were present when the welfare officer arrived? Yes. And you took her through the house? Yes. Was Mr. Ashcroft present? He arrived partway through. So for the initial portion of a welfare investigation into the Ashcroft household, the parent was absent. The household caregiver was present, she said, which is me, which is what caregiver means. A small sound from somewhere in the room, not loud, but Whitmore registered it. He shifted to the financial situation. He asked about the USDA loan application, about the bank's concerns, about the outstanding note on the property. She answered everything factually because the facts were not her enemy. They were that a family had carried debt and had addressed it through proper channels, and the situation was being resolved. The ranch has significant financial obligations, Whitmore said. Most working ranches do. And you believe that represents a stable financial environment for 4 children. I believe a family that faces challenges and addresses them together represents a stable environment for children. Yes. She kept her voice level. The alternative you're suggesting is that because a family has faced financial pressure, the children should be removed to a wealthier household. I don't think that's what stability means. Judge Wallace was looking at her. Whitmore paused. She saw him recalibrate. She could see it happen, the slight adjustment, moving off that line. He went to the question of her qualifications, or lack thereof, to care for children. No formal training, no education in child development. A woman who had answered an advertisement. You would describe yourself as qualified to raise 4 children, he said. I would describe myself as someone who has been doing it for 8 months and whose results speak for themselves. She looked at him directly. The children's doctor will testify. Their teachers will testify. The welfare assessment is already in evidence. I'll let those things speak to whether I'm qualified. He said he had no further questions and sat down. And she understood from the way he sat down, a controlled motion, a fraction sharper than necessary, that the cross-examination had not gone entirely as he'd wanted. She stepped down from the stand. When she passed Gideon's table, she didn't look at him. Helen had told her not to, keep it professional. But she felt him looking at her, and she kept her chin level and her back straight and went to her seat and breathed. The rest of the morning was witnesses. The children's pediatrician, Dr. Angela Rowan, who testified in the calm, specific language of medicine that all 4 children were in good health, meeting developmental markers, showing no signs of neglect or chronic stress. She was direct and not easily rattled, and when Whitmore tried to suggest that a single year of good checkups didn't speak to the prior period, she said that children's bodies told stories, and what she saw in these 4 children was consistent with the care they were currently receiving. The school principal, a woman named Adele Burke, who had been running Haskell Elementary for 14 years, was precise and a little formidable in the way that experienced educators are when they are defending something they believe in. She said that Owen Ashcroft had shown measurable improvement in engagement over the past 6 months. She said that Samuel Ashcroft had gone from nearly nonverbal in social settings to participating in classroom activities. She said that Cora Ashcroft's teacher had noted a marked increase in her confidence. She said these things not as opinions, but as documented observations. Whitmore challenged the timeline. Were these improvements attributable to the Ashcroft household specifically, or to natural development? Principal Burke said that in her 14 years she had learned the difference between natural development and a child who had been given something they were missing. She said these 4 children had been given something they were missing. She said it without drama, as a fact. Manny Herrera took the stand just before lunch and was, Rosalie thought, the most effective witness of the morning because he was impossible to rattle or reframe. He was a man who said what he meant and had the lifetime of work on his face to back it up. He said he'd known Gideon Ashcroft for 15 years. He said he'd watched the man grieve his wife and hold his ranch together and love his children in the way a man who doesn't say much loves things, through showing up, through the work of it, every day. He said when Rosalie came, that changed something that had been stuck. He said he didn't know how else to put it. She unstuck something that had been stuck. Whitmore asked if he could characterize the nature of Rosalie's relationship with the children. Manny looked at him. She's their mother, he said. Not the one they were born to, but the one that's there. The afternoon session opened with Dr. Marcus Webb, the Aldrich's expert witness, who was a polished man who understood the architecture of testimony and gave his opinions with the confidence of someone who had done it many times. He spoke about the developmental risks for children in households with financial instability and inconsistent caregiving. He spoke about the period following Margaret Ashcroft's death as one of documented dysfunction. He referenced the CFS inquiry as evidence of community concern. He was careful never to lie outright. He framed everything as concern, as risk factors, as patterns worth noting. Helen's cross-examination of him was methodical and a little brutal. She established first that he had never visited the Ashcroft ranch, never met the children, never observed the household in operation. She established that his opinion was based on records and filings, not direct assessment. She established that the CFS inquiry had concluded with no findings of neglect, a fact his testimony had referenced only obliquely. She asked him whether it was within his professional opinion that a household could recover from a period of grief-induced dysfunction. He said yes, of course. She asked what factors he would look for to indicate such recovery. He listed them: educational engagement, health maintenance, behavioral stability, consistent caregiving. She then walked him, slowly and methodically, through the evidence already admitted: the school records, the medical records, the welfare clearance, the neighbor testimony. She asked him, for each factor, whether the evidence supported its presence in the Ashcroft household. He said yes to each one, with decreasing willingness but accuracy. She thanked him and sat down. Ruth Fells was worse than expected in the specific way that witnesses who are in over their heads are worse than expected. She contradicted herself twice within her direct testimony, established that her second visit to the ranch had occurred during a week when all 4 children were at school and she had therefore not observed them at all, and under Helen's cross could not name a single concrete instance of neglect she had personally witnessed as opposed to a general impression of disorder. You formed an impression, Helen said. Yes, Ruth Fells said, during a visit to a home where the mother of 4 children was actively receiving cancer treatment. A pause. Yes. And you're presenting that impression, formed under those circumstances, without meeting the children, without speaking to their father, as evidence of unfitness. Ruth Fells looked at the petitioner's table, looked back. I was concerned, she said. We were all concerned. I understand, Helen said. No further questions. Then Eleanor Aldrich took the stand. She was composed. Composure was, Rosalie suspected, something she had been practicing for months. She spoke about Margaret, about their childhood together, about the way she had watched her sister fall in love with a man and a life that Eleanor had believed from the start was not enough for her. She cried, real tears, or close enough to real that the distinction didn't matter in a courtroom. And she spoke about the funeral and about wanting to be there for the children and feeling pushed away. She said, and this was the moment Rosalie felt the room shift. I am not trying to take these children from their father. I am trying to ensure that they have what Margaret would have wanted for them. A stable home, a secure future. People who can give them what they deserve." She paused. Margaret died believing Gideon would be all right. I don't think she knew how hard things would get. It was well done. Rosalie gave her that. It was built to be hard to argue with because it was built on love, or the performance of it, and love was hard to cross-examine. Helen stood up. She began gently. The early questions were about Eleanor's relationship with Margaret, about the frequency of visits, about the contact with the children since the funeral. Eleanor had seen the children twice since their mother's death. Twice in 14 months. Twice, Helen said, in 14 months. Gideon made it difficult. Were you prevented from calling the children? A pause. No. Were you prevented from sending letters, cards, gifts? No, but did you send any? A longer pause. I sent cards at Christmas. One set of cards in 14 months, Helen said, and you are before this court expressing concern for the children's well-being. Whitmore objected. The judge sustained, but Helen had already moved on. She asked Eleanor about the conversation at the funeral, the words she'd said to Gideon. Eleanor softened them. Helen asked if she was certain of her recollection, because Gideon Ashcroft's account differed significantly. Eleanor said memories of that day were painful and difficult. Helen asked about the connection between Douglas Aldrich and Barton Colhane of First Harlan County Bank. Eleanor's composure flickered. A small thing, a fraction, but Rosalie saw it and she believed Judge Wallace saw it too. Eleanor said her husband's business relationships were not her area. Are you aware that First Harlan County Bank has been in active negotiation regarding the Ashcroft Ranch property for approximately the same period during which this custody petition was being prepared? Whitmore was on his feet. Objection. Relevance. Helen turned to the judge. Your Honor, we believe the evidence will show a coordinated effort between the petitioners and a financial institution to create conditions of apparent instability at the Ashcroft Ranch. The bank's interest in the property is directly relevant to the petitioner's motivations. Judge Wallace looked at Whitmore, then at Helen. I'll allow the line of questioning. Objection overruled. Eleanor Aldrich's composure did not collapse, but it tightened. The careful warmth of her testimony went a degree cooler, and she began giving shorter answers. And shorter answers on a witness stand are the sound of someone who has stopped trusting where the next question goes. Helen established, through Eleanor's own testimony, that Douglas Aldrich and Barton Colhane had been introduced through a mutual business associate in Dallas, that they had met at least 3 times in the year before the petition was filed, that Douglas Aldrich had expressed interest in the agricultural land market in West Texas as an investment opportunity. She did not make a direct accusation. She laid the stones in a path and let the path speak. When Helen sat down, the room was different than it had been when Eleanor Aldrich had taken the stand. Gideon testified in the late afternoon, and he was, Rosalie thought, better than she'd expected and more vulnerable than she'd feared, and somehow both of those things worked in his favor simultaneously. He was not eloquent. He said he had struggled after Margaret died, and that he had made mistakes, and that the ranch had suffered, and that he had not managed his grief well or his children's grief well during that first year. He said it without flinching from it. Then he said that things had changed, and he said why they'd changed, and he said it plainly. Rosalie had come, and she had stayed, and she had built something with them that he had not known was possible to build again, and he was not going to let anyone take his family apart. Whitmore's cross of Gideon was aggressive in a way his cross of Rosalie hadn't been, pushing at the financial situation, the prior instability, the period before Rosalie arrived. Gideon answered everything directly and without defensiveness, which was harder to attack than defensiveness would have been. When Whitmore asked if he believed the children were better off with Rosalie present, Gideon said yes. When Whitmore suggested that an argument in her favor was an argument for the children's instability. Without her, Gideon looked at him and said, "My children are better with their father and their family together. That's not an argument for removing them. That's an argument for leaving them alone." The session ended at 5:40. The judge called a recess and said closing arguments would begin at 9 the following morning. Helen gathered her papers, and Rosalie sat in her chair for a moment before standing, just breathing. The room was louder now, people moving, the Aldrich's team in close conference on their side. She looked at them. Douglas Aldrich with his silver hair and his expensive suit, Eleanor in the dark blue dress, both of them in conversation with Whitmore in the low, urgent tone of people recalibrating. She looked at Eleanor specifically. Eleanor, who had cried on the stand and said she wanted what Margaret would have wanted. Eleanor, who had sent one set of Christmas cards in 14 months and was calling it concern. She tried to find the thing underneath the strategy. And she found it, she thought, finally. Eleanor Aldrich was not a monster. She was a woman who had lost her sister and had decided the way to manage that grief was to acquire something her sister had left behind and call it protection. People organized their losses differently. That didn't make her less dangerous, but it made her human, and Rosalie had found that humans, even the difficult ones, were easier to face when you understood what they were actually afraid of. She was afraid of the grief. She'd been afraid of it since Margaret got sick. This was the shape of it, the custody petition, the legal strategy, the connection to Culhane, not primarily a real estate play, though it was that too. Primarily a woman doing something because doing something felt better than grieving and accepting that you couldn't fix what had broken. Rosalie understood that. She didn't forgive the damage it was trying to do, but she understood it. Outside the courthouse. The evening was still warm, the Texas summer not through with itself, the sky going orange in the west. Gideon stood next to her on the courthouse steps, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Helen was behind them, on the phone. "Tomorrow," Gideon said. "Tomorrow," she said. He put his hand on her back briefly. A simple thing. She felt it all the way through her. Helen came off the phone. "I want to go over the closing argument tonight. Dinner first, you both need to eat. Then we work." She looked at them both with the professional assessment that Rosalie had come to rely on, the gaze that missed very little. "We're in good shape," she said. "I want to be clear about that. We came into this hearing with good facts and we presented them well. The bank connection landed. Ruth Fells was not useful to them. Dr. Webb was less useful to them after Cross than they'd expected." She paused. Eleanor was harder. She's a sympathetic figure even when she's wrong, and the judge will not be entirely immune to that. But what I need you to understand is that judges in family court have seen sympathetic petitioners before. What they're looking at underneath the sympathy is, what is actually best for these children? And the answer to that question is in every piece of evidence we submitted. She looked at Rosalie. "Your testimony," Helen said, "was exactly what I needed it to be." Rosalie looked out at the parking lot, at the flat evening sky. "I just said true things," she said. "Yes," Helen said. "That's what I needed." They went to a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse and ate in a tired, wired quiet. And afterward, they went to Helen's temporary office in a hotel meeting room she'd rented, and they worked for 2 hours going over the closing argument, refining language, anticipating what Whitmore's closing would emphasize. When Helen was satisfied, she told them to go sleep. They drove back to the ranch. The children were at the Herreras for the night, Manny had insisted. The house was quiet in the way it was only quiet when the children weren't in it, which was a different kind of quiet than any other kind, with a shape like absence. She stood in the kitchen and thought about all 4 of them. Sam with Rabbit, Owen with his questions about birds and spiders and cloud formations, Cora with her chin out and her flat biscuits getting less flat every week, Eli, who had started in the last few weeks to occasionally just read a book in the evenings, like a person who had remembered that he was allowed to. She thought about this courtroom tomorrow, about closing arguments and a judge who had seen this before and who, Helen believed, knew the difference. "Hey," Gideon said from the doorway. She turned. "Come to bed," he said. "There's nothing left to prepare." She looked at the kitchen, the corkboard with the children's information, Owen's drawing still taped inside the cupboard door, the biscuit recipe in Cora's handwriting that had appeared on the counter one day and that she'd kept there like the most important document in the house. "Okay," she said. She turned off the light. She followed him upstairs. And she lay in the dark, and she didn't run through arguments or rehearse facts or anticipate Whitmore's closing. She listened to the ranch settling around her, the night sounds, the bird she still didn't know the name of but had stopped needing to name, and she felt the weight and shape of what she had built here, imperfect and unplanned and entirely real, and she held it the way you hold something you're not willing to let go of. In the morning, the judge would decide. But tonight, in the dark, with everything uncertain and every decision made and nothing left to do but face what came, she lay in the bed of a man who had asked her to stay and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That was enough to sleep on. So she slept. She was up before 5 the next morning, which was earlier than even her usual 5:15, and she didn't fight it. She lay there for about 4 minutes, listening to Gideon breathe and watching the ceiling go from black to the particular gray that comes just before the sky decides what color it's going to be. And then she got up quietly and went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She didn't make biscuits. There was no one to eat them. The children still at the Herrera's. And the kitchen without the children in it had a stillness that she had never quite gotten used to, even overnight, even for one night. She stood at the window with her mug and watched the ranch come visible in the early light, the shapes of the barn and the fence posts and the truck in the yard assembling themselves out of the gray the way they did every morning. And she thought about all the mornings she had stood at this window and how entirely different they felt now from that first morning in March, when she hadn't known any of their names yet, and the suitcase was still in the room, and leaving had still been a real option. She was not the same person who had gotten off that bus. She wasn't sure exactly when the change had happened. It wasn't one moment, it was more like the way a season changes, incrementally, until one day you notice the light is different, and you can't point to the hour it shifted. She had come here with $42 and a plan that went approximately as far as the end of 1 week, and she had ended up with a family and a ranch and a court hearing and more at stake than she'd had in her entire life prior, and somehow none of that felt like too much. It felt like the right size, like her life had finally grown into its actual dimensions. She was thinking about this, about the strangeness of that, when Gideon came into the kitchen at 5:40, which was earlier than his usual, and she turned and looked at him and saw that he hadn't slept much after she had. His eyes had that specific quality of a person who has been awake in the dark, thinking hard. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured himself a mug and came and stood beside her at the window. They looked out at the ranch together in the early light, not talking. She had learned in the months of living alongside this man that some mornings were for talking and some were for standing together looking at the same thing, and that the second kind was not lesser than the first. It was its own form of communication, a statement made by proximity rather than language. After a while he said, "Whatever happens today." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't finish that sentence," she said, "because I know what you're going to say, and I don't want a contingency plan. I want us to go to that courthouse, and I want Helen to give her closing argument, and I want the judge to make the right call, and I want to bring our children home tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "Our children," he said, not repeating it to correct it, repeating it the way you repeat something that sounds right for the first time. "Yes," she said. "Ours." He put his hand around her coffee mug briefly, over her hands, a gesture that was warm and awkward and entirely him. Then he stepped back and said he was going to go check on the animals before they had to leave, and she nodded and he went out, and she stood there at the window a moment longer, holding the mug, feeling the weight of the day ahead, like weather you can see coming from a long distance. Helen met them in the courthouse parking lot at 8:45. She had the rolling case and the charcoal suit and the expression of a woman who had spent the previous evening doing precisely what she had told them to do, which was sleep, and who had therefore arrived sharper than anyone who had been awake worrying. She assessed them both quickly, the way she always did. "You look like you slept," she said to Rosalie. "Some," Rosalie said. "Good enough." She looked at Gideon. "You look like you didn't." "Some," he said. "Also good enough." She pulled the case handle up and started toward the building. "Closing arguments. Then we wait for the ruling. Wallace doesn't always rule from the bench. She may take it under advisement and issue a written ruling within a week. I want you prepared for that possibility. If she doesn't rule today, it doesn't mean anything either way." "How often does she rule from the bench?" Rosalie asked. "In cases she considers straightforward, usually the same day." Helen said it without emphasis. She didn't need to. The courtroom filled the same way it had the day before. The weight of the room, the old wood smell, the particular quality of light through the high windows. Rosalie sat beside Gideon at the defense table and kept her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing even. The Aldriches came in at 8:58. Douglas Aldrich looked straight ahead. Eleanor looked at Rosalie as she passed, a look that lasted 1 second, and in that second was more complicated than Rosalie had expected. Not pure hostility, not satisfaction. Something more like the look of a woman who had committed to a direction and was no longer entirely sure of the road, but had gone too far to stop easily. Rosalie held the look without blinking and without malice, and Eleanor looked away first. Judge Wallace entered at 9 on the minute. Gerald Whitmore gave his closing argument first, by the order the judge had established. And it was everything Helen had predicted. A careful reconstruction of the household as it had been during the worst period, the months directly after Margaret's death, with the CFS inquiry as its centerpiece, the financial situation as its foundation, and the argument that stability for these children meant the security that the Aldrich family could provide. He was professional and controlled, and he said nothing untrue, and the shape of what he built was designed to look like concern rather than acquisition. He said near the end, "The children of Margaret Ashcroft deserve to be raised in an environment that honors their mother's hopes for them. We believe that environment exists, and we believe this court has the authority and the responsibility to ensure these children have access to it." He sat down. Helen stood up, so began quietly, which was not what Rosalie had expected. She didn't begin with the evidence. She began with a question. She said, "What does stability actually mean for a child?" She let that sit for a moment in the room. Then she said, "The petitioners have argued that stability means financial security, a large house, private schools, a household with established resources. And I want to be honest with this court. Those things are not nothing. Resources matter. Security matters. No one is arguing otherwise." She paused. "But this court has also heard, over the past 2 days, what 4 specific children in a specific household in Harlan County actually look like. Their doctor testified about their health. Their principal testified about their engagement and their growth. Their neighbors testified about what they observed in that household week after week. And the welfare officer who investigated allegations against this household found nothing, not reduced standards of care, not marginal adequacy, nothing. She found children who were loved and cared for." She walked the judge through the evidence methodically, the way she'd done in cross-examination. Not dramatically, just precisely, stacking each piece against the allegations the petition had made, showing the gap between what had been alleged and what the documented record showed. Then she stopped. She said, "I want to talk about Rosalie Ashcroft for a moment, because the petitioner's team has characterized her as an employee who married her employer, and I want this court to understand what that characterization misses entirely." She turned toward Rosalie briefly, then back to the judge. "She arrived at this ranch in March with nothing and no expectations beyond a week's work. She stayed because 4 children needed someone to stay. She organized financial documents she had no obligation to organize, sought resources she had no obligation to seek, prepared this family to face a banking pressure campaign that she had no obligation to expose. She did all of this before anyone asked her to, and before there was any personal stake in the outcome for her. She did it because it needed doing, and she was there to do it." Helen's voice didn't rise. It just became more exact, the way a blade becomes more exact when it's properly sharpened. "The petitioners want this court to see her as a convenient arrangement. What the evidence actually shows is a woman who built a family out of her own hands and has spent 8 months making sure it held together. That is not convenience. That is the definition of what a parent does." She let that sit. Then she said, "We are asking this court to see what is actually in front of it. 4 children who are healthy, growing, going to school, sleeping in their own beds, living in the home where their mother raised them, cared for by a father who loves them, and a woman who chose them. The petitioners have the resources to provide a different life. They do not have the right to substitute their preferences for these children's reality." She looked at the judge directly. "We ask that this petition be denied in its entirety." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, that particular courthouse quiet that follows something that landed. Judge Wallace made a note. She looked at both tables. She said she would take a brief recess. The recess was 37 minutes. Rosalie knew because she watched the clock on the wall of the hallway, where she and Gideon sat side by side on a wooden bench, while Helen made phone calls at the far end and courthouse staff moved past on their ordinary business. 37 minutes, during which neither of them said much. Gideon sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Rosalie sat straight and watched the clock and thought about the children, about all 4 of them, about where they were right now, probably eating Carmen Herrera's breakfast, and not knowing that the thing that determined the rest of their childhoods was being decided in a limestone building 40 miles away. She thought about what she would say to them tonight, whatever happened. She thought about the specific conversation she would need to have with each of them, the different languages of 4 different children, none of whom could be told the same thing in the same way. Eli would need facts, Cora would need honesty and space, Owen would need reassurance wrapped in something concrete, Sam would need proximity, just someone there, close. She knew all of that. 8 months of paying attention had given her that. A court officer came into the hallway and said the judge was ready. They went back in. Judge Wallace settled into her chair and looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. And when she looked up, Rosalie understood from the set of her face that she had made her decision and that it was not tentative. This court has reviewed the petition filed by Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Aldrich regarding the minor children Elijah, Cora, Owen, and Samuel Ashcroft, Judge Wallace said. Her voice was even and precise, the same voice she'd used throughout the proceedings, with no additional weight in it, which meant the weight was all in the content. The petition alleges that the children's current living situation represents an inadequate environment for their development and well-being and requests that custody be transferred to the petitioners. She paused. She looked at both tables. The court has heard 2 days of testimony and reviewed substantial documentary evidence. The picture that evidence presents is not ambiguous. She glanced at her notes once. The children are healthy, meeting developmental benchmarks, attending school consistently, and by every measurable standard, thriving. The household welfare investigation that the petitioners relied upon as evidence of instability concluded with no findings of neglect and no recommended action. The financial situation of the ranch, while the subject of ongoing management, is not in a state of crisis and is being addressed through appropriate channels. Rosalie's hands were pressed flat on her thighs. She kept them there. The court also notes, Wallace continued, that the timing and construction of this petition raises questions that the petitioner's testimony did not adequately address. The connection between the petitioner's household and a financial institution with active interest in the Ashcroft property was not explained to the court's satisfaction. The court does not draw conclusions beyond what the evidence supports, but it notes the pattern. She set her notes down. Custody determinations are made on the basis of the children's best interests. That standard does not mean the most financially comfortable environment available. It means the environment in which these specific children are most likely to thrive, which this court assesses based on their documented reality, not on projections of what a different arrangement might hypothetically offer. She looked at the petitioner's table for a moment, then at Gideon's. The petition is denied, she said, in its entirety. Custody of the minor children remains with their father, Gideon Ashcroft, and their stepmother, Rosalie Ashcroft. The court finds the current household to be a stable, adequate, and caring environment for all 4 children. She set her pen down. This matter is closed. She stood. The room stood with her. Rosalie sat for 1 second longer than everyone else before she stood up, because her legs needed that second. She heard Gideon exhale beside her, a long, deep exhale, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding in his chest for months. Helen was already turning to them, her face carrying the controlled satisfaction of a professional whose work had been validated, and she reached across and shook Rosalie's hand and then Gideon's. "It's done," Helen said quietly. "It's done," Gideon said. Rosalie looked at the front of the room, at the judge's bench where Margaret Wallace was collecting her own papers with brisk efficiency, the ruling made and filed away in the particular way judges file rulings. Not casually, but not reverently either, just as the conclusion of a process that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. She looked at the petitioner's table, where Whitmore was speaking quietly with Douglas Aldrich, and Eleanor was sitting very still, not gathering her things, not moving, just sitting. Still as a woman who has used everything she had and found the end of it. Rosalie looked at her and did not feel triumph. She wasn't built for triumph in the gloating sense. It required a kind of expansiveness about your own victory that she'd never had. What she felt was simpler and quieter. She felt the things settle. 4 children in a specific house on a specific ranch in Harlan County were going to stay in that house. That was the only fact that mattered. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Gideon held the door for her. In the hallway, Helen walked with them to the elevator and said she'd send the final billing and the certified copy of the ruling within the week, and that if the Aldriches attempted any further legal action, which she considered unlikely given the ruling's language, to call her immediately. She shook both their hands again, professionally, and then she did something that surprised Rosalie. She paused before turning away and said, "For what it's worth. What you built at that ranch. That was the whole case. I just put it in front of the right person." Rosalie looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Helen nodded and walked back toward the courtroom. Rosalie watched her go and thought, women like that. Women who do the work with precision and without need for more credit than the work itself. She wanted to remember that. She thought she probably would. They drove to the Herreras to get the children. Gideon drove and she sat in the passenger seat, and neither of them said much for the first 5 miles. And then Gideon said, "I want to call Manny before we get there. Let him tell the kids it went right." "Yes," she said. He called from the truck phone, and she heard Manny on the other end say something that sounded like "I'll be damned," and then something she couldn't make out. And then the call ended, and they drove the rest of the way in a silence that was, she thought, the best kind of silence she'd ever sat in. The Herrera place was 3 miles down the county road, and when they turned into the driveway, they could see the children on the porch before the truck stopped. 4 of them. Manny must have called them out, and they stood in the order she had come to know as theirs. Eli at the back, upright, watching. Cora next to him, chin out, arms crossed, but the grip of them looser than usual. Owen on the steps, vibrating with the particular energy of a child who has been told good news and cannot contain it. And Sam at the front with Rabbit raised overhead in what was apparently a victory gesture. Gideon stopped the truck and got out, and Owen ran at him full speed, and he caught him, all 55 pounds of him, which she knew from the doctor's appointment last month, and held him up with the ease of a man who had been doing that for 8 years. And Owen said something against his shoulder that she couldn't hear. She got out of the truck. Cora was watching her from the porch steps with that expression, the one that was always a calculation, always a measure. Then she came down the steps. She didn't run. That would never be Cora's way. She walked at a pace that was slightly faster than normal, which for Cora was the equivalent of running, and she stopped in front of Rosalie and said, "We're staying." "You're staying," Rosalie said. Cora looked at her. The chin was doing the thing. The eyes were bright. "Okay," she said, and for the second time Rosalie heard that word from Cora, the way you hear something that has real meaning in it, a door opening rather than a subject closing. She put her arms out just slightly, a small offer, not a demand. Cora stepped forward and let herself be held, briefly, stiffly, with the specific posture of a girl who is still learning that being held is allowed. Rosalie held her lightly, the way you hold something that needs to feel it can let go any time. And after a moment, she felt Cora's shoulders drop a fraction, and she understood that as the real thing. Not the hug, but that drop, that release. She let her go. Cora stepped back and straightened and looked at the middle distance and said, "I'm going to make biscuits Saturday." "Okay," Rosalie said. "Better ones than last time." "Probably," Rosalie agreed. Eli came off the porch and stood in front of her. He was 14 and taller than she remembered him being in March, which was the strange time compression of watching children grow when you see them every day, and then suddenly measure the distance from where they started. He looked at her with that serious face, that face that was already more Gideon's than he probably knew. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." He nodded, the nod. And then, unexpectedly, quietly, he said, "Thank you for, you know." He gestured vaguely, which covered approximately 8 months of evidence. "All of it." She looked at him. "You held this family together for a year before I got here," she said. "Don't forget that. That was you." He looked at the ground for a moment, then up. "We held it together," he said, with the particular precision of a boy who has just decided on something and said it the way he meant it. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "We did." Sam arrived at her knees with Rabbit and presented both of them for inspection, and she crouched down to his level and received them seriously and said hello to Rabbit and hello to Sam, and Sam said, "We're not going to Dallas," with the satisfied certainty of a 4-year-old who had understood the essential fact and required no further information. "No," she said, "you are absolutely not going to Dallas." Sam nodded, satisfied, and went to show Gideon that Rabbit was available for celebration. Carmen Herrera came out onto the porch and called them all inside for food, in the way Carmen Herrera handled all significant events, by putting a table in front of people and feeding them until the significance settled somewhere manageable. They ate enchiladas and rice, and Manny told a long story about a horse he'd once owned that made Gideon laugh. A real laugh, not a polite one. The laugh of a man who has just put down a weight and discovered his body still remembers how to do that. And Owen asked Carmen 6 questions about how enchiladas were made, and Carmen answered every single one with the same gravity she gave all of Owen's questions, which Rosalie noted and appreciated. They drove home in the late afternoon, all 6 of them, the truck a little full. Owen pressed between Rosalie and the door in the front seat, because nobody could quite agree on the back configuration, and eventually Gideon said, "Just get in," and they'd gotten in. The ranch came into view around the last bend in the county road the way it always did. The house, the barn, the fence, the flat gold land around it. And Sam said from the back, with complete casualness, "Home." One word. A 4-year-old single word, said the way you say something that requires no annotation. She looked out the window. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that. In her own mind, she had no patience for the version of the story where the court ruling was a magic line and everything before it was dark and everything after it was light. That was not how lives worked. That was not how the ranch worked, or how any of them worked. The ranch still had a debt that was being managed month by month. Eli still sometimes got up too early and did too much before anyone else was awake, the old habit of hypervigilance that didn't disappear because the external threat did. Cora still had days where her grief was a room she went into alone and didn't want company in, and Rosalie had learned to respect that room's door. Owen still asked too many questions for any one adult to fully answer. Sam still needed the double knot. None of that changed. What changed was smaller and more real. It changed in the way that a held breath changes when it's finally let out. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the texture of everything that followed. The house stopped feeling like something they were defending and started feeling like something they were living in. There was a difference, and it was a difference you felt rather than measured. Barton Culhane did not come back. She didn't know exactly what had happened on his end, whether the judge's comment about the financial connection had reached ears it needed to reach, or whether the failed custody play had simply made the property too complicated to pursue, or whether he had simply moved on to easier targets. She suspected all three. She also suspected that Manny Herrera, who knew everyone in Harlan County and was not a man who forgot things, had some quiet conversations she was never told about. She didn't ask. Some problems solve themselves when you stop giving them leverage, and this appeared to be one of them. The USDA loan restructuring finalized in September, 3 months after the hearing. The terms were not perfect. Nothing in a loan restructuring is perfect. But they were workable, and workable was what the ranch needed. Gideon came in from a phone call with a look on his face that she had learned to read as the financial version of relief, which was not relaxed exactly, but was steady, in a way it hadn't been before. And he sat down at the kitchen table and said, "We're all right," in a voice that had no performance in it at all, just the fact. They were all right. "I know," she said. She put coffee in front of him. "I knew you'd get there." He looked at her. "You knew before I did." "Usually," she said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Helen Garza sent the certified copy of the ruling and a final invoice in a manila envelope, and inside with both was a handwritten note that said simply, "Give those kids my best. You all earned this." Rosalie taped the note to the inside of the cupboard door, next to Owen's drawing of the friendly rectangle barn. Helen would not know that, but Rosalie would see it every morning when she got the coffee, and that felt like the right place for it. Eleanor Aldrich sent a letter in October. It came in a regular envelope, handwritten, no law firm letterhead. Gideon put it on the table in front of Rosalie without opening it, which was its own kind of statement. He wanted her to decide. She opened it. She read it once. It was not an apology, exactly. It was not an apology either. It was a letter from a woman who had come to the end of something and found that the view from there was different from what she'd expected. Eleanor wrote that she missed her sister, that she had made choices she could not entirely defend, that she did not expect any response or any relationship, but that she wanted the children, she called them by name, all 4 of them, in the right order, to know that they had an aunt who thought about them. She did not ask for anything. She just said it. Rosalie folded the letter. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she wrote back, a single page, and she said that the children were well and growing, and that she was not going to keep them from knowing their aunt if they wanted to know her, because they had lost their mother, and additional loss served nobody. She said the door was not closed. She said what Eleanor did with that was up to her. She did not show either letter to Gideon. She told him what she'd done, and he sat with it for a long moment, and then said, "That was more generous than she deserved." "Maybe," Rosalie said, "but those kids have one aunt in the world." He looked at her, nodded once. "You're right," he said. She didn't hear from Eleanor again until Christmas, when a card came addressed to all 6 of them. Inside was a check for what Eleanor called something for the children, for whatever they need. The check was significant. Rosalie talked to Gideon about it, and they talked to Helen briefly to confirm there were no legal complexities, and then they put it in a savings account, one account for each of the 4 children, divided equally. Eli's college fund, Cora's, Owen's, Sam's, 4 equal portions, nothing taken from it, nothing added to it from the household budget, just sitting there and growing with the compound patience of money set aside for a purpose. Cora found out about it in January, not because they'd hidden it, but because she was Cora and Cora found out about everything eventually through the reliable process of paying attention. She came to Rosalie in the kitchen and said, "The money from the Aldriches. Yes, you kept it. We put it away for you, for when you need it." Cora turned this over. Her face went through several things. "Why?" she said, after everything they did. Rosalie set down the dish she was drying. "Because money is just money," she said. "It doesn't have the thing that happened attached to it. And you're going to need it someday. And someday you'll be grown up enough that the thing that happened will be a story you can tell without it having the same size it does right now." She looked at Cora directly. "And because your aunt is not a good person, but she might be trying to become a better one. And people ought to be allowed to try." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then, "Even people who try to take you away from your family?" "Even then," Rosalie said, "it doesn't mean you have to trust them. It just means you leave a little room." Cora stood there processing this with the focused concentration she brought to everything that required her to revise an existing opinion. It was one of the things Rosalie genuinely admired about her. She could be convinced. Not easily, not without evidence, but she could. Some people couldn't. Cora could, if you gave her time and truth in equal measure. "Okay," Cora said. And that was the end of that. Spring came back around, the first anniversary of Rosalie's arrival at the ranch, which nobody mentioned out loud because nobody needed to. She marked it privately, the way you mark things that don't require ceremony to matter. She stood at the kitchen window on a morning in mid-March and looked out at the ranch in the early light and thought, 1 year. She tried to remember what she'd thought that first morning, standing in the same spot, not knowing any of their names, still deciding if she'd leave by the end of the week. She couldn't quite retrieve the feeling of it. It had been so specific to a version of herself that no longer fully existed. That woman with $42 and a belt-held suitcase and nothing ahead of her she could clearly see. She remembered the circumstances, but not the feeling. The feeling had been replaced by this one. This one was harder to name. It was not happiness exactly, though it contained happiness. It was more like the specific satisfaction of a life that had turned out to be the right size for the person living it, of being somewhere that made sense, of having finally done the thing that fit. She heard Sam on the stairs, his particular footfall, the one she'd know in a crowd, the slightly uneven rhythm of a 4-year-old navigating stairs with care and Rabbit under his arm. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas with his hair going in 4 directions and looked at her. "Biscuits?" he said. "Biscuits," she said. He came in and climbed onto his chair and put Rabbit on the table in front of him, facing the counter, so Rabbit could watch. And she turned to the flour and the butter and the cast-iron skillet that had been the most used thing in this kitchen for 20 years, and was going to be the most used thing in it for 20 more. She heard Owen coming next, thunderous down the stairs the way Owen did everything, followed by the careful tread of Eli, who had been up since before 5 probably, because Eli was always up before 5. Though he was getting better about coming downstairs and eating instead of just doing things alone in the dark. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch coming in from the morning check, the mudroom door, the sink. She heard, from upstairs, the particular silence that meant Cora was still asleep and intended to stay that way for another 20 minutes and would arrive exactly when the biscuits were done, with the timing of someone who had calibrated this without admitting she'd been calibrating it. She worked the butter into the flour with her hands, the way her mother had taught her, the way she'd shown Cora, the way Cora would someday show whoever came after. There was a line there, she thought, not a grand one, not the kind people make speeches about, but a real one. The way knowledge passes. The way you learn something from someone who needed to give it, and you carry it forward into a life they never knew you'd have, and you give it to someone else who'll carry it somewhere you'll never see. Her mother's recipe in this kitchen. Her mother's recipe in Cora's hands on Saturdays. That meant something. It didn't need to mean more than it was. Gideon came into the kitchen, poured his coffee, came and stood beside her the way he did in the mornings sometimes, just present, not requiring anything. She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the window, at the morning light on the ranch, the same view she'd been looking at earlier, and his face had the look it had settled into over the past months. Not entirely at peace, because he was not that kind of man, and probably never would be, but steady. Like a fence properly fixed, like a barn that had been repaired until it would hold. She had helped do that. Not alone. He'd done the main part, the grief and the rebuilding and the holding on through the worst of it. But she'd been there alongside. She'd handed him what he needed when he needed it, and asked him to do the same for her when her turn came, and he had. That was what they had. Not a story where one person saved another, but a story where two people stood in the same place and chose, every day, to keep standing there. Owen came in and asked 3 questions before he sat down. Eli came in and sat without a word and pulled a book from the side of his chair where he apparently kept one for mornings. And she looked at him, 14 and reading at the kitchen table in the morning, not managing, not watching, just reading, and felt something warm and uncomplicated move through her. Cora came down exactly as the biscuits came out of the oven. She sat down and looked at the biscuits and said, without preamble, "I'm going to make them next Saturday." "You say that every week," Owen said. "And I do it every week," Cora said. "They're getting better," Sam said, with the diplomatic generosity of a 4-year-old who had strong biscuit opinions but loved his sister. "They're almost as good as mine," Rosalie said. Cora looked at her with an expression that was absolutely an attempt to suppress a smile and was not entirely successful. "Almost," she said. They ate. They were loud and imperfect, and Eli spilled his juice at some point, and Gideon handed him a towel without comment, and Owen immediately offered 2 theories about why the spill had gone in the direction it had, and Sam fed Rabbit a piece of biscuit off the edge of his plate, and Cora argued with Owen about the theories, and Rosalie sat in the middle of all of it, and ate her breakfast and looked at the corkboard on the wall with the children's doctor's number, and the permission slips and the note from Helen Garza tucked up there now, alongside the rest of it. This was what she had. A loud, imperfect, ordinary morning on a ranch that had nearly broken and hadn't. 4 children who were not easy and not uncomplicated and who were the most important thing she had ever been responsible for. A man who didn't say much but meant everything he said. A life that had not gone according to any plan she'd made because she hadn't been making the right plans until she stopped making plans and started paying attention to what was actually in front of her. She had come here with $42 and a worn suitcase and a newspaper advertisement and nothing else. She had stayed because a 4-year-old cried through a wall, and she went to make dinner and didn't know how to leave. People would tell the story different ways. Some would say she saved the family. Some would say the family saved her. Both were too clean and too simple for what had actually happened, which was messier and slower and more specific than either version captured. What had actually happened was that 6 people, none of them whole, none of them without damage, had ended up in the same place at the same time and had chosen, repeatedly, daily, without ceremony, to hold on to it. That was the whole story. That was what it came down to. You hold on, you do the work, you make the biscuits, you answer the questions about spiders and clouds and horse dreams. You stay when leaving would be easier, not because staying is always right, but because sometimes the thing you stayed for turns out to be the thing you were looking for without knowing you were looking. She looked out the kitchen window at the ranch in the morning light. She had come here to do housekeeping. She had done that. She had also done everything else. Sam reached over and put his hand on her arm for no reason. Just contact, just presence, the way small children reach for the people they trust. And she looked down at him, and he was already looking at something else, at Owen's juice glass, at whatever Owen was explaining now, and his hand was just resting there on her arm, the way you rest your hand on something solid. She put her hand over his, just for a moment, just to say, "I'm here. I know. I'm here." Outside, the ranch went about its morning. The light moved across the pasture the way light moves when it has all the time in the world, which it does, which has always been its most useful quality. The fence posts held. The barn held. The house held. They all held.